Chapter 239. The main hall of Abe's castle was bustling with activity. Brando, Medisha, the Shire, Scarlet, and the Nightsong Tiger were all gathered together. They watched as the mercenaries carried a huge dusty map out of the basement and placed it on a long table. When the map was placed horizontally on the long table, everyone around the long table couldn't help but sigh softly. However, only the younger of the Wild Elf sisters asked, "My lord, how did you know that bastard would put the map in the basement?" After she finished speaking, she immediately looked at her elder sister carefully. Fortunately, Furlern didn't look for trouble with her this time and only glared at her in annoyance. In fact, the scene of Brando becoming an elementalist had shocked her to the core, and she was still in a daze. Brando knew that the bastard she was referring to was Grodin, but the once arrogant Baron was currently lying in the courtyard outside. He was not in the mood to collect the scum's corpse, and he might be able to use it in the future. He looked outside the main hall and saw the mercenaries gathering in the inner hall. Other than eliminating the remaining enemies, one of their tasks was to search for Bai Tiamas Chiyoyu, who had escaped. However, Brando knew that Bai Tiamas would not stay in Abe's castle. Even though Bai Tiamas lost miserably in their previous encounter, Bai Tiamas would not do anything meaningless. For example, staying here to give him trouble and vent his anger was not the habit of the Black Knights of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. If it was the Red Knight, Ladios, then it would be possible. However, Bai Tiamas would never put himself in danger for no reason. This was one of the reasons why he was the most difficult to deal with among the four knights of the Apocalypse. He would not leave any traces that could be used against him. Most of the nobles have the same habits, Tia. Brando replied while thinking, and I don't think Grodin was the one who put this map down. I doubt he has the will to govern this territory. His words were half true and half false. He knew that the map had nothing to do with the nobles' habits, but he knew exactly what was in the basement. Even though he wasn't one of the players who overthrew Grodin, he was still aware of the details of the incident. Brando looked at the map. It was probably a map left behind during the construction of Abe's castle. Naturally, it was not Grodin's handiwork. Perhaps it was left behind by the previous generations. The young wizard beside him frowned when he saw the map. This map has at least a few decades of history. The Shire coughed twice and said, "Doesn't he care about his territory at all?" In the territory of the Black Tower Adepts, the Adepts redraw the map every year. Brando shook his head. You think everyone is a wizard? Furthermore, this is Trentheim, the most barbaric region in the whole of Aween. What else can you expect? He swept the dust off the map with his hand and replied, "In this era, it's normal for the map of a small city like this to remain unchanged for a few decades. It's barely usable. Besides, we don't need such a detailed map right now." In this era? The Shire frowned and looked at him. You have a habit of saying that? Brando raised his head and rolled his eyes. Do you have a problem with that? No, the young wizard quickly shook his head. It's just that when you say it, my lord, it's filled with a sense of history. When you say it, my lord, you're already standing at the height of history. You're truly wise and mighty. Brando didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Enough with the nonsense. But he suddenly remembered something. Right, lucky hands? No, Falern, where's the equipment I asked you to organize? The elder of the Wild Elf sisters seemed to have just woken up. She was stunned for a moment and asked, "What is it? Cleaning up the battlefield?" "Oh," Falern was slightly startled. "Is it the remains of that skeleton? Speaking of which, there's something strange that I wanted to ask my lord." "Something strange?" Brando paused for a moment. The equipment dropped by a gold-ranked commander of Madara like Kabia's wouldn't be that bad. However, there were many strange equipment in the Amber Sword. Other than the low-level toys, all of the fantasy grade and above items were considered small artifacts by the players. That was why he couldn't help but be curious when he heard what Lucky Hands said. But just as he was about to ask, he saw Cornelius, who was sweating profusely, and a young man in a green-gray robe walking into the hall. Seeing the two of them, Brando's expression turned serious and he immediately interrupted Falern's words. He hurriedly asked Cornelius, "How is it?" "We're well rested, my lord. We can set off at any time." Cornelius carefully glanced at him and replied. His words were like a signal, and everyone in the hall picked up their weapons and stood up from their seats. Even Scarlet, who had been chatting with Sifrid, patted her shoulder and stood up. Brando looked at them and nodded. "Then let's set off. I'll leave Rabin's support to you, Lord Cornelius. I'll have Miss Medisha go with you. What's the situation on the other side?" Medisha nodded to Cornelius after hearing Brando's words. Cornelius frowned and shook his head. We've already sent the signal but there's still no news. I've already sent a scout to contact them, but they won't be back for a while. It's too late, Brando shook his head, we have to set off immediately. But my lord, I know Yuta, Cornelius suddenly said, even if she doesn't arrive in time she'll still do her best to delay Madara's undead. My lord, I don't think you need to worry too much, Brando interrupted him before he could finish, it's useless. They won't be able to delay the undead. I know Madara's usual tactics better than all of you. Under the encirclement of the endless skeleton army, unless they are in a defensive position, the 200 to 300 mercenaries are like stones thrown into the sea. In just a moment they will be reduced to ashes. He placed his hands on the table and looked at everyone, not to mention there's still the necromancers and dark warriors hiding among them. Brando straightened his back and picked up Scarlet's sword. The only thing we can do now is to set off immediately. The only thing left is to pray that Miss Yuta can reach the west gate in time. Otherwise there's only one outcome. The hall fell silent. Everyone looked at each other, but when they saw that Brendel did not say another word after he finished speaking, he picked up his sword and left his seat. They were stunned for a moment, but they still followed him one by one. At this moment, Seal lifted his head from the dusty map and asked calmly, so the worst outcome is to give up on Ferber City, right? My lord? Everyone was stunned. They didn't understand why the young adept would change the topic to this. But Brando stopped at the door and looked back at him. What did you think? I was just thinking that my lord is as daring as ever, Brando smiled faintly. Because the price is too high, he replied. I don't want to lose money. I can only choose the path with the highest returns, even if the risk is higher. But like I said, a dead man won't care if there's 1 or 2 ropes around his neck. That's true, but now I know that my lord and Miss Roman are a perfect match. Brando smiled. My lord. The Nightsong Tiger did not understand. The Shire's words are exactly what I plan to do, Brando nodded. Not only do I want to kill Groudon but I also want to claim Tanajul. Count Randner wants to teach me a lesson, and I'll use this land that originally belonged to him to teach him a lesson. Victory or defeat is not only determined by strength, but also by wisdom. No one can win against the future. He stepped out of the door and looked back at the silver-haired middle-aged man who was the only outsider in the hall. Besides, who said that a new noble can only have one piece of land? Don't you agree, Cornelius? Cornelius was sweating profusely as he looked at Brando in a daze. There was only one thought in his mind, either I'm crazy or this young man is crazy. He's challenging the traditions of this ancient kingdom and the rules of the game between the nobles. Forcefully invading a noble's land, Martha above. If he succeeds he'll overturn Erwin's ancient beliefs. The silver-haired middle-aged man lowered his head and thought of another possibility, they've all gone mad. However, the Shire had a different opinion from the mercenary leader. The young magus raised his head and asked without surprise, but now it seems that the risk is indeed very high. The undead are just outside the city and if we give up Abes, my lord will lose the excuse to establish a foothold in Tanajul. So, my lord, what do you plan to do? Do you plan to hide in the forest and fight as a guerrilla? By the way, my lord, what did you say about the 16 words you taught me last time? Brendel smiled faintly and turned his head back. His gaze passed through the large arched door outside the corridor, and it was dark outside. But Brando knew that dawn was only a moment away. Perhaps the sun would rise from the horizon in the next moment. However, could Abes really hold out until the next moment? Man proposes, God disposes. The young man replied, since you've chosen the life of a gambler, then you should calm down and enjoy the thrill of a gambler. As for guerrilla warfare, he replied, don't worry, I'm also a descendant of a grandmaster. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 240. There are no enemies. There are no enemies on the left either. Those damn skeletons aren't here either. Shouts could be heard on the empty street. Yuta turned around. Her anxious dark green eyes reflected a faint light. Where did those undead go? The mercenary leader's slender fingers pressed on the handle of her rapier. The doubts in her heart were like a fog that gradually spread out. Everyone looked around in this fog but they couldn't find anything. The mercenaries moved forward in the darkness. Their footsteps were rustling. The unknown was hidden in the silence of the night. Everyone's heart was imperceptibly cold. Fear was like a shadow hanging over everyone's head. It didn't need to speak but it still grabbed everyone's throats. It was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. Everyone was vigilant with their bright eyes in the dark. They were afraid that the undead, who had suddenly disappeared without a trace, would rush out from an alley and surround them so tightly that not even a drop of water could trickle through. They crossed half of the city. They thought that they would encounter those bloodthirsty undead on the way and then engage in a life-and-death battle. But the enemy seemed to only exist in their imagination. The undead at the west gate didn't seem to exist at all. Could it be that the young noble made a wrong judgment? Yuta turned around. The light from the illuminating crystal in the young man's hand penetrated deep into her eyes, reflecting his pale face due to malnutrition. "Leader?" the young man asked. "What? Could it be that the noble made a wrong judgment?" He whispered, "Could it be that they went around to the north?" "Impossible," the mercenary leader firmly denied this judgment. "Every second counts on the battlefield. The enemy's commander can't be an idiot." "But..." The young man still wanted to say something, but someone in front of them shouted, "Leader!" Both of them were startled and looked in that direction at the same time. "What's wrong?" "I found something," that person shouted. "Come and take a look." Yuta and the young man looked at each other, nodded, and followed. But when she turned the corner, she was stunned. The scene on the long street had completely changed. It was as if a fierce battle had taken place here. As far as the eye could see, there wasn't a single intact stone slab on the ground. All that could be seen were large pits one after another. The cracked stone slabs seemed to have been overturned by some kind of powerful force from the ground. Some of them were even thrown dozens of meters away. If it weren't for the fact that they couldn't feel any elemental disorder caused by the elemental power in the air, everyone present would have reason to believe that there had been at least a battle of gold-tier strength here. Yuta raised her head and saw a two-story building not far away from her. It had caved in and collapsed on one side. It looked as if the center of the building had been hit by something. The wooden beams that supported the structure were all broken. That kind of attack was at least at the level of silver. She took a deep breath and walked forward while looking at the skeletons and human corpses in the pit. "Who are those people?" The female mercenary group leader looked at the corpses and frowned. The corpses were dressed the same as the poor people outside the city. That was easy to explain, but what about the skeletons that were scattered around the corpses? She had observed carefully and found that the casualty ratio was close to 5-1. That meant that there were at least 5 skeletons beside each human corpse. If the poor people outside the city were this strong, Yuta wondered how Groton was able to survive to this day. The mercenaries shook their heads. "Where are their weapons?" she asked again. "No weapons," the mercenary replied. "No weapons." Yuta took a deep breath. "Are you trying to tell me that these humans fought the undead with their bare hands, or that they are the Silver Folk?" "Leader, I don't know if they are the Silver Folk, but the first thing I want to say is that they are the Silver Folk." The mercenary who called out to them earlier lowered his head and answered softly. Yuta's eyes flashed. The things that happened tonight were beyond her understanding. At this moment, the sound of hooves could be heard from the street. Everyone looked up and saw 2 or 3 riders parting the night mist and stopping in front of them. They were the scouts that were sent out earlier. The female mercenary group leader immediately snapped out of her thoughts and asked, "What's the matter? Did you find anything ahead?" "Leader," the rider immediately replied, "there are sounds of fighting coming from the city gate." "Sounds of fighting coming from the city gate? Does this mean that the refugees pushed the undead back?" Everyone stopped and couldn't help but look at each other. "Martha above, what kind of situation is this?" The light in the darkness was not as simple as a white paint on a black background. Especially in the deep darkness, the only ray of light seemed to be the hope that flowed in people's hearts. Although they were not illuminated by it, they still wanted to move towards that ray of light. Even if it was just an imagination that existed in the heart, people were willing to trudge towards the direction of light in the darkness. Even if there was a deeper shadow behind them, they were willing to face the light. In the darkness, the light of the torch flickered. The girl quietly knelt in front of the torch. The red light of the torch outlined the soft lines of her cheeks. Between the light and the darkness, the beautiful lines extended to her neck and the shadows under the edge of her face. Her dark eyes reflected the light of the torch, as if there was a flickering flame in the deepest part of her pupils. She quietly pursed her lips and put her hands on her knees, motionless. It was as if everything in front of her had nothing to do with her. With a loud bang, a vine that could only be hugged by 2 people suddenly rose from the ground. Along with the gravel and soil, it formed a bough and whipped towards the white skeletons under the night sky. The vine, which was dozens of meters long, swept across the sea of skeletons. With a series of crackling sounds, Countless broken skeletons were thrown high into the air and swept to the side. 3 tall men wearing animal skin robes with cold expressions stood on the city wall and commanded the vines. It was as if they were cleaning up garbage, and the vines repelled the skeletons that surged up from below again and again. The werewolves who stood beside them, even though they were half hunched over, were a head taller than the 3 men. They stared at the sea of undead with gloomy eyes, ready to repel the sneak attacks of the dark warriors and necromancers hidden among the undead. The battle had lasted for almost an hour. Finally, a tall werewolf walked to the girl's side and bowed his head respectfully. "Miss Amandina, it seems that reinforcements have arrived." Amandina's eyes flashed. "Who are they?" she asked. "They seem to be mercenaries." She turned back to look at the city wall and nodded without saying a word. She gently turned around and saw the merchant lady hugging her precious bag with both hands. Her upper body was completely sprawled on the battlements on the other side. She was sleeping soundly with her eyes closed. Her eyelashes drooped down like thick brushes. Her cheeks were rosy under the light of the fire. She looked so delicate and charming that it would make anyone want to take pity on her. Of course, that was if her mouth was not slightly open, and she was drooling in her sleep in an extremely indecent posture. Amandina sighed a little helplessly and reached out to pat the girl's face. Slap slap. The Roman immediately smacked her lips and waved her hand subconsciously. She muttered softly, "If you want to kill a Roman, please wait until I'm done sleeping." Amandina suddenly felt a sense of exhaustion. "Roman." I know, the little Roman furrowed her eyebrows in her sleep. "Please get a number and line up." Next, Yuta was shocked when she saw Amandina for the first time. The mature female mercenary leader could not help but frown as she looked at the strangely dressed people. The werewolves, druids, and the undead of Westgate were practically useless under their suppression. Not to mention that they were late. Even if they did not come, the outcome of the battle would not have changed at all. But she could not help but wonder who these people were. She did not know if these people were the young noble's subordinates, but if they were, did it mean that he did not trust her at all? Then that young man should have some follow-up measures on Rabin's side. She took a light breath. Even though she knew that this was normal, she still felt a little uncomfortable. It was as if she had made up her mind to work hard but was denied in the end. Even though she was mature and determined, she could not help but feel a little hopeful. Especially after witnessing the young man slaying Grodin with his own hands during the night's battle, she had a faint glimmer of hope in her heart. She hoped that this was an opportunity to change her fate. Not just her but the entire mercenary group. In this chaotic world there was never a day of peace. She hoped that the young noble was a lord worth following, at least he could make her subordinates feel a sense of belonging. But nobles were all the same. No matter how different they were, they would only think about how to scheme against others all day long. That was why they were always suspicious of others and did not trust anyone. Even the young noble could not escape from this circle. The female mercenary leader tucked her fiery red hair behind her ears and fell silent at the thought of this. But Amandina raised her head and looked at the woman who was almost a head taller than her. Her expression was calm and did not move, as if she did not want to show any weakness. These should be the mercenaries that the Lord has subdued? She thought about it for a while and she had a rough idea of what he was thinking. But when she looked at the other party's every move, she suddenly understood. She seemed to have guessed the female mercenary leader's thoughts and asked, "May I ask who you are?" Jana looked at the little girl. Although the other party was much younger than her, she could still feel a faint sense of oppression from her. "Tsk, another noble lass." The female mercenary leader cursed in her heart, but when she opened her mouth, she spoke with a mocking tone. "Jana, leader of the Mountain Swallow mercenaries, we were sent by his lordship. Who are you, little girl? Here comes the test." Amandina smiled lightly in her heart, but her expression did not change as she replied, "I am also the Lord's subordinate. To be more precise, I am his chief advisor." She stretched out her hand. "This is a Roman lady, the Lord's fiancée." The merchant girl yawned and rubbed her eyes sleepily. As expected, Yuta's heart skipped a beat. A trace of disgust and disappointment flashed in her eyes. This trace of disappointment and disgust did not escape the noble girl's eyes. As expected, she had the same thought as Yuta, but her expression changed and she replied coldly, "But Miss Yuta, please do not be suspicious. Even though I am here as the Lord's advisor, it does not mean that I agree with his actions." She raised her head and looked at the female mercenary leader with a cold expression. "So, Miss Mercenary Leader, please help me tell the Lord, if he thinks that by being single and abandoning everything he can avoid harming others, I hope that he can abandon this naivety." Even though I do not know what kind of person the Lord wants to be, I know that a true hero is not a saint who does not make mistakes, but a man who dares to take responsibility. Even if it is a wrong decision, I hope that he understands that a person's life does not only belong to himself, but also to everyone who depends on him, cares for him, and loves him. Just like how I respect the Lord's decision, but I will never forgive him for abandoning his subordinates. Also, please tell him. Amandina suddenly stopped and looked into the distance. In this world there is no hope and freedom that can be obtained through charity without bloodshed and struggle. Amandina stopped and her last sentence was transmitted far and wide. A moment later, every werewolf on the city walls turned around and looked at the noble girl with an indescribable light in their eyes. Yuta was slightly taken aback. She looked at the girl and asked, "What do you mean?" Amandina did not answer. There was a dead silence on the city walls. The female mercenary leader looked at the Roman beside her, but the merchant girl only smiled sweetly at her and asked, "Auntie, the Roman wants to ask if you have a signal arrow?" Yuta was stunned. When the signal arrow rose from the west gate, the bright light of the fire illuminated the depths of everyone's eyes. Brando, the Shire, and Scarlet behind him stopped in an instant, and the mercenaries following them also stopped in an instant. Everyone subconsciously raised their heads to look at the resplendent light. It was like a prayer, a blessing telling everyone on the battlefield, telling them that they had won. Brando took a deep breath. If he was a gambler, then he would be the luckiest one. This was because the moment the roulette stopped, the needle of fate had precisely opened the door on the only path. As for what was behind the door, he might not be able to see it clearly, but at least he knew that he had won again. He had taken the first move from Madara and Groudon's hands. However, at this moment, Charles turned back to look at his lord. The young wizard smiled and said, "So, after the darkness, it's already the dawn of the world? My lord?" "No," Brando looked at the ray of light and shook his head, "it's just that, I can already see the ending." Author's note, the last chapter of the Dusty Kingdom. It took some time to come up with this chapter, so I'm going to take a break after the explosion to think about the next chapter. I'm going to have to deal with the double monthly votes that are coming soon. Sigh. May the round God bless me, Godi Sagro. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.gdn.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 241. It's unusually quiet here, Gale said. The afternoon sun shone on the withered leaves, and the light in the forest was constantly changing. "My lord, there's a legend among the mountain people. The reason why the forest is so quiet is because the goddess of the lake is watching over it. In such a place do not turn around," Tyrese said. The Viscount's pale hand rested on the hilt of his sword as he looked into the forest. There was a path of wild beasts. "My lord, you must be joking." Gale felt a chill run down his spine as he looked around. It was as if there really was a pair of eyes hidden in the shadows. "Chaos above, the gods are nothing but illusions." "No, Gale," Tyrese replied, "I believe that the gods are real." Gale looked at the young Viscount, as if he was trying to see the source of this heresy from his kind eyes. Turst was the son of all for one, and those who were chosen for this position had to be carefully selected by the higher-ups. Whether it was wisdom, talent, or loyalty to the teachings, he was one in a million. Even though his personality was fickle, it was still hard to believe that he would say such a thing. "If there are gods," Gale replied, "then what we're doing, is it not blasphemy?" Tyrese looked at him as if he was mocking the young knight's weakness. "If there are gods," he said, "are they necessarily correct?" "I don't think so." Gale was speechless, and only then did he realize the difference between him and Tyrese. The young Viscount turned around and saw that at the edge of the forest, the knight had finally pulled the boat ashore. "Let's be on our way," he snapped his fingers. "In such a place we might run into something like a ghost at night. Even though it's not much of a threat, it's still troublesome." He held the hilt of his sword with one hand and swept the corner of his gray robe on the ground. Gale followed closely behind him. Not long after, a knight caught up with them. "My lord, the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 7th squads have all arrived," he reported in a low voice. "We received a signal from the north, and other than us, the others have already reached the shore. As for the other teams, they didn't seem to be able to pass through the fog outside." Turst looked at the scenery of the forest with great interest, as if the light from the forest had melted into his narrow eyes, causing them to soften. "So," he said, "there are 37 of us, are there not?" The knight nodded. 37 silver tiers, including me," he pointed at himself, "should be enough to deal with a knight of the lake. If the information is correct, Gale didn't answer. Terst turned around when he heard the rustling of footsteps in the forest. Gale's hand was still tightly gripping the hilt of his long sword, his nose hissing. "How big is this island, my lord?" he asked. "Are you scared?" Terst asked. "Gale, the fisherman said that the Knight of the Lake will not appear outside White Mountain." Gale took a deep breath and released his hand stiffly. "I'm sorry, my lord." Terst smiled good-naturedly. The group passed through the forest and met up with their companions in the north. They arrived at the holy white rock before the sun set in the afternoon. The afterglow fell on the white stone walls, dazzling them. The young Viscount placed his hand on the boulder in front of everyone. His slender fingers traced the uneven surface of the boulder, and the rough texture gave him a sense of history. It was as if he had gone back in time, thousands of years ago, to the time when a king came here with his sword and slumbered in this forest. "There is a king here," he said. "Do you know who it is?" "King Eric?" Gale asked. "No," Terst shook his head, "it's not him." He lowered his hand and walked along the boulder. It didn't take long for them to find a cave that led to the interior of the boulder. Behind the cave was an emerald forest, which the natives called the Forest of Dreams. The young Viscount stopped and asked, "Is this the place?" "Yes, my lord," the knight behind him replied. "The information said that the Knight of the Lake is in the forest behind us." "Then are you all prepared with your weapons?" Everyone patted the swords at their waist. Terst nodded with satisfaction. "If that's the case, then follow me." "Kaasabov," the knight replied. Brando sat in front of his walnut desk and suddenly felt the philosopher's slate tremble slightly. "Again?" He was slightly surprised. After a moment of confusion, he put down the quill in his hand and took out the philosopher's slate and placed it on the desk beside the letter. The sage slate trembled slightly, as if it had suddenly come to life on the wooden table. But after a while it calmed down. It did not move. "What's wrong, my lord?" Amandina asked and blinked her eyes. She sat quietly on a high-backed chair beside Brando, and the sunlight shone in from the window. Her posture was elegant, and her neck was as slender as a swan's. Brendel turned back to look at her, lost in thought for a moment. "It's nothing." He used his hand to push the philosopher's slate lightly, but there was still no reaction. "It's probably a low-frequency resonance," Brando thought for a moment. "It's a common occurrence recently." He opened the drawer and placed the philosopher's slate inside. He then took out the quill from the ink bottle, but his train of thought was interrupted and he did not know where to start. Brando rubbed his temples as he felt a headache coming on. "Are you writing a letter to Miss Freya?" Amandina glanced at the letter on the desk. "Yes, my head hurts." Brando replied, "Even though we killed Grodin, the real trouble has only just begun." He raised his head again. "Tell me, Amandina, how should we deal with Count Randner?" Amandina raised her head and looked at him with a hint of annoyance. "I thought my lord had a plan," she replied. "Why didn't you ask for my opinion when you insisted on doing things your own way?" "If I gave up," Brando smiled, "would you be at ease?" Amandina turned her head away and did not say anything. "Sundara," Brando thought to himself. He poked the quill on the paper and asked, "By the way, what did you mean when you said those words to the mercenary leader?" "What I meant on the surface." "I don't think so," Brando shook his head. "I understand that you have complaints in your heart, but you and I both know that you're not someone who speaks without thinking, and you shouldn't say so much in front of an outsider." He took the parchment, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it out of the window. "Aren't you smart, Amandina?" "I'm lucky to have a subordinate like you." Amandina looked back at him with a hint of admiration in her eyes. "It was because my lord wanted to subdue the mercenaries," she replied. "That's why I acted on my own accord." "So you don't blame me?" Brando breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank the heavens." "I've never blamed you," Amandina smiled faintly. "I'm just a little angry that you left me behind." She furrowed her brows. "I'm more worried that I won't be able to keep up with my lord's pace. I don't know, maybe there's something deeply rooted in my heart that will lead me further and further away." Brando smiled. "I won't go too far if I have the heart." But he did not say it out loud and took out another piece of parchment. "So you have an idea, Amandina?" he asked. Amandina nodded. "More or less." Amandina said, "My lord is taking risks and I'm afraid we won't be able to resolve the danger we're about to face. But when it comes to conflicts between nobles, it's best to use a small force to gain a large one. First of all, we need to see if we can find a backer, but I'm afraid we can't rely on traditional means. Our foundation is still shallow, and no one will take the risk of offending Count Randner. We can consider his enemies, but our strength is too small, and our actions have already challenged the rules of the game. Amandina thought for a moment before continuing. The remaining options are those that don't make sense. For example, the Southern Legion. Madara isn't out of the question. Brando waved his hand. Forget about Madara, he replied. Tell me about the Southern Legion. Count Randner and Madara must have a few reasons for forming an alliance, Amandina replied. The first reason is to use Madara's hand to weaken the Southern Legion. The second reason is to allow them to suppress the strength of the Highlanders within Randner's borders. Have you noticed, my lord? Madara's undead army has not taken a single step into the lightning pool of the Goddess Lake. From the information we receive from the outside, they are most active in the autonomous regions of the Highlanders. Amandina continued, if that's the case, the Southern Legion will be isolated and without reinforcements. I'm afraid that they will hate Count Randner for not caring about them. However, the Southern Legion's garrisons are mostly barren lands or forests. The biggest problem they face is a lack of supplies. If we can form an alliance with them, we can at least guarantee that we won't have to worry about Count Randner's safety. You mean Madara? Amandina nodded. It's a good idea. Brando used his quill to scribble on the parchment. His gaze was focused on a point outside the window as if he was thinking about something, but the Southern Legion is currently in deep trouble. After the battle with Madara, they have already cut off all contact with the outside world. Whether or not this organization still exists is a problem. Even if it does, how to contact them is another problem. He stopped writing and took a deep breath. We can't rely on luck, so this idea can only be used as a backup plan. I can send people to Mount Gralas, but before we receive any concrete information, this is only a safety measure. Is there anything else to consider? What about the silver elves that my lord met? Can they be of help? Amandina asked. If we're talking about borrowing strength, they're the biggest help. P.S. I'm designing the later parts of the story. Chapter 242. Silver Elves? Brando tilted his body and rested his chin on one hand. Of course, but the friendship with the Silver Folk is one of the last cards I can use. I will try my best to avoid using this card until the very end. He asked, is there anything else? Amandina looked at the yellowed letter under the young lord's pen. Other than parchment and sedge, most of Tanagel's paper came from a certain paper tree, in the Grimoires region in the south. The locals called this tree, Douai Gold, meaning the tree that produced gold. Most of these papers were sent to the rich provinces of Ampere Seal, Cipher or Corvado. But now, this trade relationship was unilaterally cut off because of the imminent civil war. The girl blinked and thought of the current situation. My lord, she looked up, do you want? She suddenly frowned, but even if the princess's faction is weak, they might not be interested in us. Besides, compared to us, the royal faction is obviously more unwilling to offend Count Randner. You hit the nail on the head, Amandina. Brando folded the second letter and crumpled it into a ball. But what if we don't borrow power but instead divert it? What will happen? He said as he threw the crumpled paper out. Divert it? This letter is indeed addressed to Princess Griffine Corvado Orderfis, Brendel replied. It's meant to give us a chance to breathe from the pressure we've been under. He flipped the tip of his quill and pushed the quill and the paper towards the noblewoman. You write it. A letter to Her Highness? Amandina took the pen and paper, took a light breath and pressed the tip of the pen on the paper. How do I write it? You decide on the format and the content is written like this. Brando snapped his fingers. On the 17th of the month of autumn's twilight, written in Tonagel, Baron Abi's fief, by Her Highness Griffine Corvado Oderfis. During the battle 2 nights ago, in Sursta, the Black Lord's undead army, led by Matter, bypassed the 4 southern territories and launched a sneak attack on Abi's castle. Not only did they cause a lot of casualties, but Grodin also died in the battle. As a pioneer knight of the kingdom and the Lord of Valhalla, your humble servant believes that I have the duty to temporarily assume responsibility for the defense of this place, thanks to the Baron's hospitality and my dual identity as the Lord of Valhalla. After a night of fighting, the undead have been repelled. However, to prevent the undead from invading again from today onwards, I will temporarily lead the defense and administrative work of this place. He paused for a moment. Until the arrival of the new lord personally appointed by Her Highness, Brando looked at the noble women who were engrossed in writing, and the scratching of the pen was like a whisper in his ear. Continue, he said, and I will question Count Randner's responsibility. Why did he conceal the fact that Insursta's undead army had stopped in the south, and why did he let Madara's army pass through the 4 territories without alerting anyone? Secondly, I hope that Her Highness will forgive me. Lastly, I will attach a magic stone that recorded the images of the battlefield as proof of my words." Amandina raised her head in surprise. "A magic stone?" she asked. "Where did this come from?" Just as she finished her sentence, there was a knock on the door. Knock, knock, knock. The young lord raised his head and answered, and the door opened. The one who came in was Falerne, the elder of the Wild Elf sisters. She looked at the two people in the room and then walked to Brando's side. "My lord," she answered in a flat tone, and placed a grayish-white stone orb covered with fine patterns beside Brando's hand. "This is what you wanted." Today the elven lady was wearing a tight leather armor with a simple short skirt. Her thin golden hair was tied up behind her head, making her look natural and capable. "Are you done with the inspection?" Brando asked. Falerne nodded. Amandina recognized that the orb in Falerne's hand was a magic stone. It was a magical item made by the mages of Buga, and it was able to record and transmit images. Before the establishment of the Silver Union, the mages and craftsmen had discovered a type of quartz that could record images for a short period of time, 1 or 2 days. However, the silver folk had channeled the quartz into a magic circle to create magic stones that could store images for decades. Magic stones were not rare, but the noblewoman took a closer look at the young man. "My liege had prepared everything yesterday," she thought to herself. "My liege may be impulsive, but he is not reckless." Brando put away the orb and said to Amandina, "With this letter we will have to see how Princess Griffin Corvado Oderfeis will react. But I believe that Her Highness is a smart person, and I believe that she will make good use of this opportunity." "You are familiar with Her Highness?" Amandina grasped the crux of the matter with her unique sensitivity. "My lord? A girl who can leave the turbulent Corvado alone, sneak back to her own territory, and borrow the power of the royal faction to oppose her brother, is this not mature enough?" Brando turned around and answered, "Amandina, don't forget that she is not yet 16 years old." He paused for a moment. "Even if we take 10,000 steps back, the people around her are not deaf or blind. The royal faction has experienced the power struggle in the palace, and they should be able to see the meaning behind this letter." He took the letter from Amandina's hand and flicked it. The paper made a rustling sound. "Count Randner is wavering between the regional faction and the royal faction. Both sides are happy to see a variable like us appear to pressure him," Brando replied. "So the key to this letter is not whether what is written in it is true, but how true it can appear. If the royal faction obtains this letter, it will be an opportunity to force Count Randner to take a stand. Choosing to be a pawn is a good choice when we are at a disadvantage." Amandina frowned. "But once Count Randner leans towards the royal faction we will be abandoned." "It's not that simple," the young lord shook his head. "Count Randner is an old fox and he is cautious by nature. How can he be easily manipulated by one side? He has an indecisive personality, and once he is pressured, his anger will be replaced by vigilance. This way, at least temporarily, the pressure on us will be relieved. But in the long run, as long as we have time to breathe, there will be variables for us." He waved the letter and answered, "In the end, strength determines fate." Amandina glanced at him but quickly lowered her eyes. Brando had told them in private that he was just a knight from the frontier, but how could a knight from the frontier know so many secrets? Only those who had received special education could know the traditions and personalities of nobles like the back of their hands. Even though the mysteries of the youth were revealed one by one, Amandina was more and more certain that there was a story behind him. She was not the only one. Most of the people who followed Brando believed so as well. "But we killed his son." Amandina was a little confused. "Are we going to let it go just like that?" For an old noble family, compared to status and power, their children are nothing. Amandina answered calmly, "Grodin is not Count Randner's only son, but he will not let this matter rest for the sake of his family's honor. No matter when, we will still have to face Count Randner's army." Brando nodded in agreement with Amandina's words. "Pawns also need to have value," he replied. "We need to show the princess that we can pressure Count Randner. If we don't even have the ability to stand on our own, no one will be willing to invest in us." "Invest in us? It's like a gambler placing a bet." Brando explained, "A good gambler doesn't just believe in luck." Amandina nodded to show that they understood. But Brando put down the letter and took out another one from the drawer. He said to Amandina, "Amandina, make another copy of this letter." Amandina was stunned. "This letter is for Reto and the others. We will have to fight Count Randner and Grodin's retainers soon." The young lord replied, "I can only rely on the mercenaries outside, but I don't know if they are reliable or not." He glanced at the door. You know that I don't like to rely on uncertainties, so I need them to give up on their original plans and meet up with me here. Amandina opened the letter and read its contents. A trace of surprise flashed in her eyes. She thought for a moment and suddenly raised her head. How do you plan to deal with the people in the Green Village? This was a question that Brando had been thinking about for a long time. He could see that the werewolves were willing to follow him, but they did not dare to speak up because of their lowly status. But he did not care about this. The Green Village had a population of more than 300, and because of the werewolves' natural constitution and the harsh environment of the dark forest, more than half of them were iron-ranked warriors. Disregarding other factors, they could be considered a powerful force to be reckoned with. He pondered for a moment. The heroine might not be able to accept the Xenia for the time being. The only way is to have them return to the Green Village temporarily. When I find that place, I will need a large number of people. That place? Amandina were surprised. A fantasy land called Valhalla. You will understand soon enough. Brando tapped on the table with his finger. By the way, what's up with the druids? I haven't asked you yet, Amandina. That's just a coincidence, Amandina replied. I didn't expect them to come when I encouraged the villagers. But I think, she raised her head and looked at Brando. They're here for Sifrid. Sifrid? Brando furrowed his brows slightly. I've almost straightened it out and will explode tomorrow. I'm looking for double the amount of votes next month. I've realized that I've been chased out a lot. I'm looking for subscriptions and recommendations. If you want to know what's going to happen next, please go to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Chapter 243. Just as Brando was about to mention Sifrid's name, the door to the room was pushed open without warning. The young lord's mouth froze as he felt a little annoyed. Who was so rude? He turned around and saw the most unique of the three faces outside the door. It was a man with dark skin with rocky edges and deep-set eyes. His hair was braided and fell on a bearskin coat. Sir, at this time you can't. The mercenary who had been forced to retreat into the room stopped abruptly. He turned around and looked at the young lord apologetically. My lord, The mercenary who had been forced to retreat into the room stopped abruptly. He turned around and looked at the young lord apologetically. My lord, Brando waved his hand indicating that it was fine. He raised his head and looked at the tall druid standing motionlessly by the door. He recognized the druid's name as Andrew, one of the elders of the Withering Tree Council. The two men behind him were Rend and Ramu, both of them from the younger generation of the Forest Council. The mercenary left the room and closed the door behind him, and the room became quiet. Andrew's eyes were sharp as a hawk's as he looked at the furnishings in the room. Since the battle had just ended, the room was still decorated in the dark red style that Grodin favored. However, there was a pungent smell coming from the thick carpet that made him frown. When the guards left, Amandina stood up angrily. What are you doing? Even though she was petite, she did not back down. How can you just barge in like that? Brando sighed when he heard her words. These beasts really don't know how to interact with humans in a civilized world. He stopped Amandina and looked at Sifrid, who was standing behind the three druids. Every time he looked at the little girl's long green hair that flowed like a waterfall, he could not help but feel a sense of freshness. Sifrid hid behind the three druids who were as tall as a bear and smiled shyly at him. Brando's expression softened a little and he asked, So, what's going on here? He was certain that the druids were here for Sifrid. The druids of the forest were a special force in the Amber Sword. They abided by their agreement with Sifrid and lived in the dark forest beyond the borders of civilization. Other than recording the effects of the magic moon on the animals in the wilderness, they also monitored the growth of the dark forest. Some of the druids had a good relationship with the locals and would occasionally come out of the dark forest to warn the locals of the invasion of monsters. But the druids of the Withering Tree Council did not belong to that group. Something must have happened in the dark forest for them to appear here. What to do with Sifrid? Lord Viscount, Andre replied stiffly, we have come to take Sifrid away. What do you mean? He asked as he looked at Sifrid. But the little girl avoided his eyes, lowered her head and nodded. This made him feel a little strange. So, Brando looked at the three druids. What business do you have with me? It's like this, my lord, the youth who had been standing behind Andelu interjected. Even though we have sought the opinion of Miss Sifrid, her father, and the village elder, Miss Sifrid still insists on obtaining my lord's permission before leaving. Is that so? Brando lowered his head to look at Sifrid. That's right, Sifrid whispered. Brother Brando. The young lord looked at her, then at Andrew's party. He pondered for a moment, and the more he thought about it, the more he felt that something was amiss. "So what's the matter?" he asked with a frown. "Just tell me." "Miss Sifrid has requested for us to form an alliance with you, my lord." Andrew's light gray eyes fell on Erwin's body, as if he was sizing up a certain part of Erwin's old nobility system. He said, "Because it's said that you got into trouble in order to save her." Andrew's stiff Kurlut's language was rather forceful. "We've considered it and it's not unacceptable, but there are a few conditions." "Wait." Brendel frowned and waved his hand to interrupt them. "I'm not interested in human trafficking. You better tell me what's going on from the beginning to the end." The room fell silent, and Amandina and Falern turned their heads to look at him. The three druids looked at each other and Andrew spoke up. "Very well, my lord. The reason why the three of us left the forest is because of the saint's prophecy." Brando raised his eyebrows slightly, but he continued to listen patiently. The druid elder continued, "The prophecy mentioned that a little girl will inherit Lady Sifrid's will, and will be born in this land." He paused for a moment. "And we believe that this little girl is Sifrid." "Apocalypse?" Brando nodded. "In the world of Wand, even though the gods were incarnated into the laws of nature, they still had the power to influence the world. When this power interfered with the history of mortals, an oracle would be sent down. This was the prophecy of the saint. But when he looked at Sifrid, the first thing that came to his mind was whether the druids were lying to him. A druid would never joke about the name of the forest god, unless they were impostors. But of course they were not impostors. The druid's magic could not escape Brando's eyes. This news surprised him. If Sifrid was born because of the saint's will, then she was not a chosen. Brando then thought of Grodin's actions against Sifrid. Perhaps the undead of Madara had received some sort of revelation from this prophecy. Furthermore, the Baron might have also received this information from the skeletons. If that was the case, then the previous mystery could be explained. It seems that the relationship between Count Randner and Madara isn't as simple as just using each other. Based on this prophecy, there's a possibility of a deeper alliance between them. But if the prophecy involves the druids and Madara's undead at the same time, then it might not be as simple as Naya. Brando could not help but think that the forest goddess and the undead were enemies, and Madara was under the protection of the darkness dragon. In this way things became complicated. "How can you be sure that the person mentioned in the prophecy," Brando asked seriously, "is Sifrid?" "My lord, we have the means to confirm it," Reed replied. "Means?" Andro nodded and immediately bowed to Sifrid. "Miss Sifrid, can you please turn around?" The tall druid bowed down to a little girl who was less than half his height, looking like a clumsy bear. It was rather comical. Sifrid nodded obediently and turned around. She parted her hair behind her beautiful little ears, allowing Brando to see a beautiful pattern on the back of her snow-white neck. It was a leaf-shaped pattern that was derived from a thumb-sized emerald in the middle of her neck, forming a vein. When Brando saw the pattern, he almost jumped up from his chair. "Naya's sacred rune," he shouted in a low voice, his hand holding the table tightly. He blurted out subconsciously, "Marcia above, daughter of the forest." Andro nodded to Sifrid, and the little girl let her hair down again. She turned around and smiled shyly. But the tall druid's expression turned serious as he looked at Brando. "My lord," Andro asked, "do you know of this legend?" "You mean the saintess of the forest?" Brando calmed himself down and nodded. "I forgot to introduce myself. I'm not Viscount Gaston, but I used that identity to deceive Grodin. You can call me Brando. I'm a Highland Knight. The Shire is my retainer." He paused for a moment. "In fact, I've learned a lot of things from my mentor, and I also heard about the legend of the saintess of the forest." Brando finished telling the old lie, and the three druids did not raise any objections. Instead, they were enlightened. Brando's claim that wizards were knowledgeable was the best excuse for him to hide his identity. Besides, the Shire would never help him expose this lie anyway. But when they heard the young lord's next sentence, their expressions changed. "The saintess of the forest is the founder of Valhalla." "Valhalla?" Andro almost rushed over and grabbed Brando's collar, but after taking a step forward, he remembered that this ordinary-looking young man was actually a terrifying gold-ranked warrior. He paused for a moment and asked, "My lord, you said that Valhalla is related to the saintess of the forest? The fantasy country that only exists in legends? You don't know about it?" Brando was surprised. The saintess of the forest was Naya's chosen one, the daughter of the forest. She was the only inheritor of the bloodline of Valhalla, and she had a considerable connection with this group of druids. He found it hard to believe that they did not know anything about it. But he still shook his head. Valhalla does not only exist in legends. On the contrary, it has always existed in this forest. But I'm curious. You have been living in this forest all this time, and yet you don't know anything about it. The druids looked at each other and whispered to each other for a while before they calmed down. The existence of Valhalla has always been a legend in this area. According to the rumor, this dusty country is one of the first few places left behind by Lady Martha, Rum said. No one can confirm the story from such a long time ago. But rumor has it that there is a primordial flame in Valhalla. If it can be reignited, the Black Forest south of Tonajul will become a place of order. He could not help but gulp. In this way, the druids of the Deadwood Council, who have been guarding the land for generations, can finally come to an end, and we can also answer to Lady Naya. So, Brando glanced at them. This is the meaning of the apocalypse. 1. Goddess of the forest. 2. A kind of wilderness. The Black Forest was a vast forest located on the border of Wond, outside of civilization. It was widely distributed from the south of Erewhon, all the way to Saint Tassol, the Knight's Nation, Grace, and even the area on the border of Iranta. Long before the Dark Age, humans had learned to explore and open up new places in the Black Forest. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 244. Wait a minute, Andelu interrupted Brando. My lord, what do you mean when you say that Valhalla has always existed in this forest? Just like what I said on the surface. Brando replied. The druid shook his head. That's impossible, he said with certainty. If Valhalla is in the forest, there's no way we wouldn't have sensed it. Andelu suddenly realized that the youth was trying to trick him. They were only here for Sifred in the first place. But Andelu had accidentally revealed so much, some of which were even related to the core of Naya's prophecy. He paused for a moment and stopped abruptly. Sir, let's return to the topic at the beginning. Sifred has given me full authority to decide on this matter. If you can't convince me, don't even think of taking her half a step out of this territory. Brendel shook his head. Sifred has given me full authority in this matter. If you can't convince me, don't even think of taking her half a step out of this territory. Andelu raised an eyebrow, but Brendel interrupted him. There's no need for unnecessary words. My understanding of you druids is no less than your understanding of yourselves. Brando said coldly, whether it's melding with the stone or forest steps, I have a way to capture you. You can give it a try. When Andelu heard Brando's words, he immediately gave up on the idea of forcibly taking Sifred away. Mortals had a very shallow understanding of druids, but this young man in front of him was obviously an exception. If he knew what he was thinking, it would not be an empty threat. He hesitated for a moment before replying, Then my lord, what do you mean? We have already made our words clear, and I believe that you can trust us. We swear in Naya's name that we have no intention of harming Miss Sifred. We are only taking her to complete the necessary ritual to become a druid. You don't want to ignite the fire seed of Valhalla? Brando asked. The three druids were stunned. What are you trying to say, my lord? The youth called Rend, who was standing behind Andelu, finally spoke up. Of course we want to ignite the fire seed of Valhalla. This is one of our main objectives in the Dark Forest. The druids also believe in Lady Martha, and this is a promise that we have always kept. He replied, But forgive me for being blunt, my lord, but I don't quite understand what you mean. My meaning is simple, Brando replied. Valhalla has always existed in the Dark Forest. He looked at Sifred and suddenly realized something. I understand now. You must have misunderstood something. The fire seed of Valhalla. The saintess of the forest did not mean igniting the fire seed, but activating a part of Valhalla's ability. The young man paused for a moment and leaned back on the chair with a playful look on his face. He crossed his fingers and said, Let's make a deal. What deal? Help me find Valhalla and I'll light the fire seed for you, Brendel said slowly. So you can become the Lord of Valhalla as a Knight of Valhalla? Andrew glanced at the young man and realized for the first time what he was thinking. Actually, this suggestion is not impossible. We druids have no desire for power. However, he changed the topic and replied, I still want to say it again. Valhalla is not in the forest. It is just a legend. Brando shook his head. All right, let's put it another way. I don't want you to help me find Valhalla. I want you to go deep into the Dark Forest and help me find some ruins. Ruins? There are ruins in the Dark Forest? Ren suddenly whispered, "Elder, the ruins we found last time in the Loop of Wind? Are you sure that the ruins are Valhalla?" Andrew suddenly reacted and glared at Brendel, questioning, "Are you sure the ruins are Valhalla? I've seen it with my own eyes and it's just a pile of rubble. Humans have ventured deep into the dark forest several times, and it's normal for them to leave behind ruins. But we've already searched the area thoroughly, and we didn't find anything related to the fire seed." Brando listened and checked in his mind. He asked, "The Loop of Wind you speak of, is it the monsoon path around the Kalanga Mountains?" The druid elder was startled for a moment and then nodded. "Then it's correct," Brando replied with certainty. He knew that Valhalla was built on the monsoon path around the Kalanga Mountains, so the abundant rain from the Dead Moon Sea in the summer allowed the crops in the territory to flourish. But this wasn't the key point. Brando suppressed his excitement. "How long ago did you find the ruins?" Andela was infected by his seriousness and couldn't help but become serious. "About 3 years ago." "Can you still confirm the direction?" "It's hard to say," Andela shook his head. "In fact, it was an accident that we found the ruins. At that time, we went deep into the Kalanga Mountains to investigate the ecology of the dark forest. If we want to find the place now, I'm afraid we'll have to send out another expedition team to confirm it. But with the general direction, it won't take much time." He raised his head. "Does my lord want to go with us?" Brando shook his head. "No, I don't have the time now." He replied, "This deal is done. Send someone to find the place and inform me immediately once there's definite news." He looked at the 3 druids. This deal was in his favor, but Brando knew that the druids didn't consider it that way. These people who lived in the dark forest didn't care about fame and wealth, and to deal with them, one had to understand what they were interested in. And the fire seed of Valhalla was an irresistible temptation to these druids. Andelu and the 2 youths behind him nodded as expected. In their eyes, Brando's proposal was also beneficial to them. Amandina had been listening to their conversation since the beginning, and she found it difficult to interrupt. But she finally found a chance to speak. When Andelu agreed to Brando's proposal, she immediately opened her mouth. "You took Sifrid away, but her relatives in the Green Village are all in the Baron of Abes. Have you not considered the possibility that Count Randner's vengeance will descend upon us at any time?" Andrew glanced at the noble's daughter. Her words made him frown. "Don't worry, my lord. When I return to the council, you will receive the druid's aid. But like we said before, we have a condition." Brando looked at Sifrid, and the latter nodded. "Speak," he said. "Our duty is only to protect your forces in the Ferber barony," the druid said as he looked at the young man. It was as if he could see the ambition in the young man's eyes. He knew that the young man's intentions were far beyond that. But he did not want the druids to be tied to Brando's war chariot, so he reminded him, "Other than this, we will not provide any more help." He was waiting for the expected bargaining, but Brando nodded instead. "The druids have always been neutral. I'm satisfied that you can say so. Let's leave it at that." He thought for a moment and added, "But there's one more thing. The area of protection includes Valhalla." Andela was stunned for a moment before he nodded, "Of course." Brando was laughing in his heart. These fellows must have been stupid after staying in the forest for so long. Even though he was much more experienced than Grodin, he was still only at this level. The druids were able to predict his plan, but they neglected the ambitions of the other nobles. Just like Tanagel's current situation. Count Randner would not let this matter rest, and war was inevitable. Moreover, even if the war ended, the other nobles would still covet Valhalla's legendary territory. The greed of the human heart was endless, and it was only a matter of time before they boarded the war chariot. Brando knew that he had to save the crumbling Erewhon from the fate of destruction. In order to fight against the great inertia of history, he had to obtain more help. Tanagel's druids were an opportunity, and a part of his plan. This was a step forward, and no matter how big or small it was, history would change forever. But he stopped and looked at Sifrid. "Sifrid, becoming a druid is not an easy task. Even though you are the chosen one of Goddess Nia, a person's fate is still in their own hands. Even if you stay here, you can still learn a lot." He paused for a moment and his voice became gentler. "So you still want to go with Andelu and the others?" His words made everyone look at him in surprise, especially Andelu and the others. In their minds, Brando was no different from the other nobles in Erewhon, but at this moment, there was a slight change in their view. Sifrid hesitated for a moment, but eventually nodded her head. "I want to go, Brother Brando," she replied. "What?" Falern looked at the 3 of them suspiciously. She did not understand the druids as well as Brendel did, and she was furious at him for handing over Sifrid, but she could not refute him due to her status. "Isn't it good for you to be here, Sifrid? Why do you want to go to the forest?" Sifrid raised her head and looked at Amandina. "Because of Sister Amandina," she answered seriously. "Me?" Amandina was surprised. "Sister Amandina and father said that it is impossible to not rely on yourself," Sifrid replied in a crisp voice. "Brother Brando is very good to me, but I can't accept it with a clear conscience. Uncle Andelu said that when I become a druid I'll have the same abilities as them." She paused for a moment to catch her breath. "At that time I'll have the ability to protect the villagers." Brando's gaze softened. "Well said," he replied. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 245. Brando walked to Sifrid's side and placed his hand on her shoulder. Sifrid is a sensible child. He raised his head and looked at the tall druid elder. "I treat her as my own sister, and I'm entrusting her to you according to her wishes. As for whether or not she can become a citizen of the forest, in Vaunt, another name for druids, I don't care, but I ask that you must ensure her safety." He paused and his tone became more serious. Can you do it?" Andelu nodded. "There's no need for you to say it, my lord." "Thank you, Brother Brando." Sifrid held onto the corner of her clothes with both of her hands and replied obediently. Brando smiled faintly and patted her forehead. The little girl's seriousness and sensibility were naturally lovable no matter where she went, but Brando did not mind her request to form an alliance with the druids. He could see that Andelu was unwilling at first, but since they had Valhalla as a connection, it was only natural for them to form an alliance. He turned to Amandina and said, "Amandina, bring Sifrid to prepare the things we need for the journey." Amandina looked at Andelu as if she had just recovered from her thoughts. She looked at Brando with a puzzled expression. "I'm going?" "Of course," Brando replied. "Even though Sifrid is still a child, she's still a girl. Only a girl like you would know what to bring. Otherwise we can only let the Roman do it for us." He smiled and changed the topic. "But are you okay with leaving Sifrid in her hands?" Amandina thought of Romaine's carefree attitude. She was afraid that Romaine would fill Sifrid's little backpack with her favorite glass beads, even though she had spent a lot of effort to buy them from the merchants back in Bucci. She sighed. "But can't Scarlet do it?" "She's not as attentive as you," Brando replied. Amandina glanced at him and felt an inexplicable joy in her heart. But when she saw Brando's gaze, she knew that he had something else to say. She thought for a moment and asked, "Is there anything else, my lord?" "Inform Cornelius to come see me," Brando replied. Amandina nodded and walked over to Sifrid's little hand. She took the little girl's hand and led her out of the door and closed it behind her. When they left, the only people left in the room were Brendel, Andrew, and Brendel, as well as the elven girl who was hugging a record book. "Do you have any other orders, Sir Overlord?" Andrew looked at the ambitious young man and asked. Even though he was not a worldly man, he knew that Brendel did not simply send Sifrid away to prepare her luggage. "We are druids and we don't know how to beat around the bush. My lord, please speak your mind." "I'm very busy, so I won't be sending you off for the rest of your journey," Brando replied. "I do have some things to say. I know that you don't think our alliance is essential, my lord." Rant, who was behind Andrew, frowned and interrupted him. But he immediately saw Brando waving at him. "Wait for me to finish." Brando opened his mouth. "I know the druid's attitude towards the dark forest, and I also know the agreement between you and Naya. This is your tradition, but I also have something to tell you. The power of chaos is very strong. You're a member of All for One?" Andelu's eyes turned cold. "Silver Sky Snake? Tree herders or sheep's head cultists?" "I thought you would put the tree herders at the front." The druid snorted coldly. "Neither." But Brando shook his head. "Those people you're talking about are all my enemies. But the enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend." "Indeed," the young suzerain said without hesitation. "But you and I both know that this era is coming to an end, and the demon moon is about to reach its peak. The last magic tide ended the era of chaos, and no one knows what will happen this time. In such an environment, it is no different from a fantasy for you to suppress the growth of the dark forest." "So what?" "I know much more about the dark forest than you do." Andelu crossed his arms and looked at the young man with extreme suspicion. They were people who had dealt with the dark forest all their lives, but now a stranger told them that he knew more about the forest than they did. This feeling was even more ridiculous than showing one's slight skill in front of an expert. It was simply arrogance for no reason. Brando just smiled. It doesn't matter if you don't believe it. Think back, before the era of chaos, the area of Wand was less than a quarter of what it is today. Who opened up such a vast territory and turned the thorny dark forest into the land of civilization today? Andelu was a little proud. It was the Druids. Brando still shook his head. To be exact, it was the ancient Druids of the Ring of the World. After the fall of the Tower of Babel, the dark dragon scattered the Druids in the wilderness, and the Ring of the World was divided into the tree herders and the orthodox Druids today. He paused. I don't need to say this, do I? My lord is indeed knowledgeable. No, it's just that we have something in common. Brindle sighed deliberately. Ever since the fall of the Tower of Babel, there has been a rift between the ancient magic system and the modern magic system. Both the Druids and the Wizards are looking for the ancient heritage, but I happen to know a member of the Dragon Clan, and I happen to know some of the doctrines of the Druids. You know ancient magic? Andelu's eyes flashed and became sharp. He knew that the only known golden tribe in this world was the Dragon Clan. Dragons were also the only existences that understood ancient string magic. Although Druid magic was an even more mysterious type of runic magic, mysterious knowledge was often shared. Moreover, since Brando said so, he must have some hidden meaning. If he still didn't understand, he would be a real fool. Awasimers. Brando almost finished the incantation word by word. Have you heard of the Seed of Life? He raised his head and asked, You should understand the meaning of this sentence. The three Druids' faces suddenly changed. The Seed of Life that Brando spoke of was the seed of the elven tree. The tree herders often transformed this thing into the golden demon tree, but the sacred tree of life was the only tree they found that could effectively transform the dark forest. It was just that the tree of life was originally rare, and other than artificial cultivation they could only look for the ancient heritage in the ruins. After all, it was an ancient heritage. They all heard that the passage that Brando recited was a transformation incantation. The core rune was Em, which represented the earth. It was very likely that it was the language of nature, of the ancient Druid magic. Legend said that it could directly purify the dark forest completely and save it from the erosion of magic. However, that kind of magic had not existed in this world for more than 1,000 years, if not for some records in the ancient books. At most, the three of them could only hear that the incantation had some connection with Druid magic. Andelu looked at Brando with a complicated expression. Language of nature? Brando nodded. My lord, you know this spell? Are you a Druid? Brando shook his head. In fact, he was not unfamiliar with this thing because the incantation was written on the ancient slate. In the later stages of the game, almost every player more or less knew something about it. However, just knowing it was not enough to use it because the only thing that supported this incantation was the ancient slate. The Wizard War later broke out because of this reason. Simply put, this was a gimmick. It looked beautiful, but it was actually worthless. However, it was enough to attract the attention of these Druids. As expected, Andelu frowned. What does that mean? Simply put, I am also interested in the dark forest, Brando replied. However, the stronger the order, the stronger the resistance from the chaos. Therefore, fighting alone is not the best way to solve the problem. As he spoke, he picked up a candle from the table. Druids are used to solving problems from the perspective of the world and the laws of nature, but the goddess of the forest has actually pointed out another path for you. What path? Andelu asked. Brando carefully used scissors to cut off a forked part of the candle's wick and then lit it. He looked up and said, That is to borrow the power of others. He replied, Since the year of chaos, other than the limited traditional model of the church, pioneer knight, the civilization has rarely expanded the scope of the guarded lands. However, because of the lack of territory and the erosion of magic, the wars between the civilizations have increased day by day. He paused and changed the topic. However, I intend to open up a new model to end all of this. Even if it's just a trial. The young lord smiled slightly. However, I am very confident. I just don't know if you are interested. Andelu lowered his head and pondered for a moment. My lord, you can just say it. What I mean is, Brando said as he picked up the envelope on the table. He tilted the candle slightly and let the hot wax drip on the envelope. To transform Erewhon into a country full of vitality and constantly expanding outwards. The three Druids gasped in unison. Andelu had expected Brando's ambition, but he did not expect the young man's ambition to be so great. His goal was not as simple as being a vassal, but to change this ancient kingdom. They could even hear that his tone was far more than that. The expansion of Erewhon. This young man wanted to build an empire with his own hands. Ambition was a good thing for some people, but it caused Andelu to feel deeply uneasy. He looked at Brando vigilantly. Expansion will bring bloodshed and war, which is contrary to our beliefs, he said in a low voice to avoid making the other party unhappy. Therefore, my lord, if you want to use this to entice us to join you, I'm afraid you are wrong. War is inevitable. Brando put down the candle and took off the ring of the Wind Empress. However, for me, war is a means to protect myself. Because I'm afraid you have misunderstood the meaning of expansion. Wait, you mean? Andelu interrupted him in disbelief. Brando nodded seriously. The expansion I'm talking about is the barbarian lance. He pressed the ring of the Wind Empress on the wax and then raised it. Using the power of the country, we will open up new territories in the barbarian lands. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 246. The expansion I'm talking about is aimed at the wilderness. Using the power of the kingdom, we can open up new territories in the wilderness. Brando replied, pausing between each word. Then he stopped what he was doing and looked up at Andrew, who was looking at him with a complicated expression. The druid elder took a light breath, but he still did not believe it. But the law of nature is a cycle, and as the lord of a land you can make things simple. But it's like a force, where there's oppression, there's resistance. You pushing all this with your own power may be a good thing for the world of order, but others may not agree. The elder paused and changed his way of answering. Opening up the borders of civilization is a dangerous and difficult thing, especially in this day and age. My lord, will you take the risk of being opposed by the majority to push all this? It's actually not that difficult. Profit will always drive people to act. Brando replied. He could not help but think that this was just like how gold and silver drove the Portuguese and the Spanish to fight to go out to sea. He was just repeating the path that Prince Enrique had taken. Besides the Holy Cathedral, he was probably the only one who knew how much value there was in the wilderness. It was just that the Holy Cathedral had to measure the ratio of investment to return, and he had a ready-made example. The return from the wilderness will naturally be the motivation for Erewhon to move forward. And people are always forgetful. When there's gold in hand, only a few people will see the risks that come with it. The young lord replied, not to mention when the majority of people's lives improve, they will not want to go back to the past. You're so sure that investment will produce returns, and that not making ends meet is a common thing. Andrew retorted, once there's a setback at the beginning of the plan, it will be a devastating blow to your entire plan. Brando laughed in his heart. The fact that they were already thinking on his side meant that he had convinced them. After all, this was an innate temptation for druids, and it was almost irresistible. That's why I need you in addition to my experience, he replied, a thorough plan with a bit of luck. Everything has its risks. You can see that individuals often fail because they lack a strong support behind them. This support is the support of the territory, the lord, and even the entire kingdom. Brando thought to himself. In fact, some great lords would occasionally take the initiative to explore new territories. However, with so many enemies, no one dared to invest too much in unknown territory. As a result, this kind of investment was usually a one-time thing that never returned. Over time, apart from the true gamblers, no one was interested in the wilderness anymore. However, this was also because most people did not have a clear understanding of the wilderness. However, he had an advantage, and that was that he knew that his investment would definitely yield returns. This was the advantage of experience. Andrew was silent for a moment before he finally nodded. All right, my lord, you've convinced me. If you can really do all this, what do you need us to do? It's not what I need you to do, Brando replied. It's just that you have to protect the fruits of your labor. You'll understand. In this world, I'm not the only one with ambition. You haven't really seen the greed of other lords. The elder druid nodded. I understand, he replied. I have to say, my lord, you're the best lobbyist I've ever seen. Brendel smiled faintly. He picked up the 2 letters from the table and said, there's one last thing I need to ask of you. Speak. Andrew took a deep breath. Brando's words had even made him a little excited. If he could really do it, then the changes to the entire world of order would be earth-shattering. If the merciful King Eric was the greatest pioneer after the Year of Chaos, then this young man would probably dominate the history of the next era. If he could succeed. Help me deliver these 2 letters. Letters? Or are they for? the elder druid asked. Pass through the forest and you'll be able to reach Port Gree from the east. Some of my subordinates are currently there. Brando replied, deliver these letters to a man called Copper Dragon Redo. Copper Dragon is his title, so I'm sure you won't get it wrong. Is there anything else? Andrew took the letters and looked through them. Brendel shook his head. There's nothing else. The only thing left is for time to prove itself. I have other matters to attend to, so I won't be seeing you off. I wish you success. Andrew nodded. Then we'll take our leave. He bowed deeply to the young lord, opened the door and went out. Falerne raised her head and watched the trio leave. She turned around and asked, My lord, are you going to deliver the letters to them as well? Even though she knew that Brando was a meticulous person, she still couldn't help but feel uneasy when it came to strangers. She didn't understand why Brando would trust 3 people he had never met before. Not only did he entrust Sifrid to them, he even entrusted them with a matter of life and death. Even if the other party was a druid, what if this identity was fake? Brando naturally couldn't explain the reason to her. He could only explain his knowledge of the druids as a wizard. But on the other hand, he couldn't tell her that he actually knew these people. Where did he meet them? That was more than 10 years later. After the Sacred Stone Conference, he spent a long time raising his prestige in the Witherwood Council. It was all for the sake of clearing the Valhalla ruins. In that era, Grodin was long gone. It was the era when Aween was at its strongest after its resurgence. No one would believe it except for a lunatic. He thought for a moment and replied, Copper Dragon Redo has always been in contact with Freya. It shouldn't be too troublesome to deliver a letter to her. Amandina glared at him. You know that's not what I'm talking about. She snapped, My lord. Brando smiled. Of course I know what you're talking about, Miss Elf. But you have to admit that I know the druids better than you do. Trust me, they're telling the truth. The prophecy of the forest should have appeared a long time ago. The druids' respect for Naya is far beyond what you can imagine. Delivering a letter for me is just a casual activity. I believe that Andrus will treat this as a test. If you don't put yourself in their shoes, it's hard to understand how important this matter is to them. Brendel thought for a while and added, If you don't put yourself in their shoes and consider their values, it's hard to understand how important this matter is to them. But? No buts. Brendel came up with an excuse. Besides, that's a consideration in itself and I have a backup plan. A backup plan? Falerne looked at him suspiciously. Why didn't she know? The 2 letters that Andrus took away were copied by Amandina. She did not believe that Brando had prepared more. After spending so much time together, she was starting to understand the young man. Of course. Brando could not help but look at Falerne, who was expressionless as usual. He paused for a moment and suddenly thought of an idea. How's the inventory? Falerne lowered her head and looked at him with a trace of disdain. Why would he interrupt a girl's conversation like this? Moreover, I'm his summoned creature. Even though she looked down on him, she still opened the book in her hand and answered in a straightforward manner, We've checked the granaries. There are about 50,000 bushels of grain stored in the granaries, enough to support the city for 3 to 4 months. However, the warehouse is basically empty. The stones, iron, and wood are far less than what we've recorded. We can't even find out the exact direction of the outflow. It was normal for the warehouse to be empty. With Grodin's ability, it was already a miracle that he did not turn Abes into a black forest. However, the ones who really needed to thank were the druids in the forest, even though they did not know that there were such people in the forest. Brando shook his head. We have to find a way to solve the stone and wood shortage. Abes is not safe right now. The walls that were damaged in the battle 2 days ago must be repaired and reinforced immediately. He could not help but rub his forehead when he thought of this. In the game's Lord mode, resources were quantified. This method of making it convenient for the players had caused him a lot of trouble. For example, in the game, reinforcing a section of the city walls required 2 units of stone and wood. However, how much would 2 units of stone and wood cost in real life? Brando had no idea. It was a pity that even though Amandina was knowledgeable, she was not omniscient. Especially when it came to matters like this, he would have to ask professional masonry or officials for advice. But the crux of the problem was that Ferber lacked both stonemasons and officials. The captains of the garrison were not willing to work for her, and most of them were recruited by Grodin from the mercenaries. They could not answer these professional questions. In fact, they did not know as much as the Nightsong Tiger, although the Nightsong Tiger was not much better than Amandina. Brando felt a headache coming on when he thought of this problem. He shook his head. In short, how much do we have left? Is it enough to repair the walls? Falern looked at him and thought, "My lord, didn't you ask for it when you cut the southern gate in half in order to show off?" However, she replied with an expressionless face, "My lord, to put it simply, we don't have, what? If you want to know more about the future, please go to www.gdn.com. Support the author, support the legal reading." Chapter 247. After listening to Falern's explanation, Brando finally put down the matter at hand and became serious. There are 4 lumber mills and 2 quarries near Abes. How can there not be any reserves? He raised his head, his light brown eyes reflecting Falern's slender figure. Even if there is no reserves, Grimoires and Randner are the most important provinces in Erewhon, and Tonagel is no exception. As far as I know, there are as many as 7 sawmills in the barony of Ferber alone. Even if we can control 4 of the sawmills near Ferber, it would still be enough to repair and reinforce the city walls within a week. Brendel paused. In the game, the lumber mill's weekly output was 1 unit, and Tonagel's specialty products were doubled. However, that was only in the game and he was not sure if it was the same in real life. "My lord, do you know about this?" Falern asked. "Of course I do." Brando suppressed his doubts and asked, "So what exactly is going on?" "There are 2 reasons," Falern said with a straight face. "First, the workers in the lumber mill are Grodin's private property, and they are not willing to work for us." "What?" "Because they are afraid of retaliation. In their eyes, my lord is bound to fail sooner or later. After all, your enemy is Count Randner, and you, my lord, are but a fledgling noble." "That's reasonable," Brando nodded. "Then let's dismiss them. Don't make things difficult for them. Without a sense of security, the people will not follow us. Humans are realistic and no one will believe in empty words. But it's fine, the key to turning the situation around is just around the corner. As long as we get through the first hurdle, our forces will stabilize." "Then before that, what about the workers in the lumber mill?" Falern asked in a calm voice. "Don't we still have the Senia people?" "That won't do." "What?" "Because before that, my lord must take back the lumber mill." "What?" Brando was amused. "Could it be that the sawmill is still not under our control?" He clearly remembered that the nearest sawmill to Abes was only a few miles away. Could it be that the noble's private army that had escaped from Abes had regrouped outside the city so quickly? In the young lord's impression, the noble's private armies did not seem to have such high combat strength and tactical accomplishments. Pharaoh shook her head and answered him. "No, according to what we know, 3 of the 4 lumber mills have already been occupied by the subterranean dwellers. The remaining one was abandoned 5 years ago." "Cavemen?" Brando asked. "Aren't they the residents of the lowest level of the underground world? Don't they live under the Jorgandi Ridge? Legend has it that the various tribes of the underground world are in endless disputes, and at the same time they are fighting with the demon lords. When did they have the time to come to the surface?" "There's a crack in the forest that connects Jorgandi Ridge to the surface world." Furlow paused for a moment. "Captain guessed that it might be a tribe that fled here during the war. Grodin doesn't care about it?" Brando was a little depressed. He knocked on the table with his knuckles. "That's his property." But he suddenly stopped when he saw the elven girl looking at him with her clear green eyes. Her eyes were clearly saying, "Who knows what those filthy nobles are thinking?" He suddenly realized that even though Grodin's lackeys were tyrannical in Abes, they were a complete mess in terms of combat strength. Even a group of mercenaries led by Brendel could easily defeat them, let alone the subterranean dwellers. In the game, mercenaries were nothing more than miscellaneous weapons in the human world. Even though the subterranean dwellers were the lowest level of residents in Jorgandi Ridge, they were also the first official army of the underground kingdom. They were equivalent to Cruz, the strongest human empire under the Holy Cathedral of Fire. They were at least light cavalry or spearmen, and were the core of the army in the Erewhon kingdom. If Grodin wanted to rely on his lackeys to fend off the subterranean dwellers, he would have a headache just defending against them, let alone attacking them. Brando couldn't help but pat his forehead as he cursed himself for being incompetent. However, this realization also reminded him of something. Even though level 1 subterranean dwellers were nothing to him, he had to realize that this was before the Second War of the Black Rose. During this time, the highest level of level 5 subterranean dwellers was only level 1. Unlike the second chapter of the Amber Sword, War and Chaos, where monsters like the great alchemist Tamar emerged one after another, ancient units also appeared in the world, and the ranks of the subterranean dwellers rose like a rocket. It was precisely because of that glorious era that Brendel's vision was so high. Thus, the current wars were like child's play to him. For example, the Insursta Dragon's invasion of Buchi in the future would be considered a border conflict, but in this era, it could be considered a rare war. After all, he only had a few mercenaries under his command. Most of these mercenaries had yet to reach the level of iron ranked, and they were considered as the noble's private soldiers in the Amber Sword. However, in this era, in this place, they were considered the main force of the war. After all, this was Erwin, not Cruz of the Eagle Empire. Thinking of this, the young lord stood up. The elven maiden who was holding a book looked at him calmly, but a hint of curiosity flashed in her green eyes. "My lord?" "Follow me," Brando replied. "Where are we going?" "We're going to meet someone." "Someone?" Falern was startled, unable to follow his train of thought. "What's wrong?" "It's nothing." Brando shook his head and took out the sage slate from the drawer. He then took the sword that the elven maiden handed to him. It was an ordinary magic sword, one of Grodin's collection. The Baron was cruel and bloodthirsty, but he was not a brave warrior. It was just that Erwin's nobles valued martial arts, so he could not help but pretend to be a gentleman. However, all of these items had now become Brando's spoils of war. The young lord weighed the sword in his hand and sighed. It was just an alchemy-grade sword with a black iron label. It could not withstand his full power, but it was slightly better than a common longsword. Every time this happened, he could not help but miss the Thorn of Light. It seemed that ever since he lost that sword, he had not found another weapon that suited him. Although he had many goals in mind, he did not have the time, or the spawn point was not on the way. He put away the sword and added, "I just suddenly felt that time was pressing." The elven maiden glanced at him. Soon, the two of them left the study and silently walked along the corridor on the north side of the castle. Brando looked at the elven maiden who was holding the book as if she wanted to say something, but she held back her words and asked, "What's wrong?" "It's nothing." Falern looked at the empty corridor in front of her and replied, "It's just that Cabia's relic is still with me, my lord." "That's right." Brando slapped his forehead. "I remember now. What was it that you wanted to ask me last time?" Falern lowered her head and rummaged through her pouch for a while before taking out a small object. She looked at Brando's outstretched hand and opened his palm, revealing a diamond-shaped golden object. Brando looked at the heavy object that looked like a golden shuttle and was slightly startled. He immediately blurted out, "So it's this. Cabia's was really lucky." He paused for a moment. "No, I should say that I'm really lucky." Falern looked at him with a puzzled expression. "This thing is called the Stone of Order, also known as the Door Stone. It's a good thing." Brando carefully looked at the golden shuttle as if he was afraid that he had misjudged it. "It can be used to expand the territory." "Expand the territory?" Brando withdrew his gaze and looked at the side of the corridor. His gaze landed on the unknown tree in the courtyard and shook his head. "I don't know how to explain it to you. The Door Stone in the Amber Sword can provide a special attribute to a territory. For example, it can increase the forest's rapid growth, lumber production +1 per week, or increase the workshop specialization, increase the probability of craftsmen being born in the territory. But he didn't know how these things worked in the game. "In any case, this is a rare treasure, but I don't know where that bastard Cabias got it from. He must have snatched it from the nobles in the southern border." Brendel thought for a while and replied, "Anyway, this is a rare treasure, but I don't know where Cabias got it from." He couldn't help but wonder if he should rob him too. Outburst of luck? Falern frowned and took out another ring. "My lord, this is also one of Cabias's relics." Brendel stopped abruptly. He stared at the emblem on the ring with a sword and shield intersecting. His eyes flashed slightly. "Warrior's ring," he said with difficulty, then asked, "This is also one of Cabias's relics?" Falern nodded, but when she saw his expression, she couldn't help but ask, "Is it very important?" "It's more than important." Brando took a deep breath. The warrior's ring, although its name was ordinary, it was just like the knight's ring, the wizard's ring, and even the elementalist's ring. At first glance, people would think that it was a common item that could be found anywhere. If you weren't familiar with its properties, you might be misled by its name. But for players who were familiar with its properties, it was one of the rare priceless treasures in the game. First of all, its level was enough to explain everything. It was a gold item and a fantasy item. Then Brando took a quick glance at its properties and understood. Sure enough, it was exactly the same as it was in the game. For example, the description of the ring could be summarized in one sentence. It was as simple as the properties on the ring. Because it only had one property. Warrior skills +1. P.S. Thanks to Cheba's bloody-soaked fleeting time, Rutiu Little 7, Great Deity, Yang 6655796, and other students for sorting out the data in this book. For now, this is all I can gather. Please contact Blue Knight. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.gdian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 248. It's more than just important. Brando said as he gently took the ring from Falern's hand. He carefully looked at the intersecting sword and saber patterns on the rings. His fingers stroked the cold brass edges and he felt slightly touched. The secondary snake ring, the ring of the Wind Empress, the ring of the Flame, and the ring of the Warrior, all three sides of the magic triangle had been filled. He remembered that in the previous game he had only completed this feat in the year of the White Holy Griffin, year 378 of the First Era. The enchanted accessories in the Amber Sword were so rare that even the legendary RMB warriors would have to wait 3 months before they could equip themselves with such equipment. On the other hand, other than the weapons in his hand that were slightly lacking, his backup ranged weapon was the brass greatshale longbow and the soul arrow. He had more than 10 enchanted accessories, including the necklace of the rock core, the star of flame, and the necklace of ghouls. He also had the Lionheart medal, the elemental bracelet, and 3 amulets. Not to mention the soul diamond and the blackwood sculpture that he made himself. His inventory of enchanted items in the First War of the Black Rose had just ended. However, it was a pity that he had never been able to obtain a true core equipment, such as the strength of the mountains and rivers, a powerful equipment that could change the composition of a character's class. However, he was already so unlucky, so he should be proud of himself for being able to reach this step. And this was because Falern was in the party. Thinking of this, he could not help but look back at the elder wild elf sister. "What is it?" Falern asked. "My lord." Brando shook his head and did not answer. He had already put the ring on his left index finger. After putting on the ring, the data on his retina changed continuously. Strength Burst, White Raven Sword Art, and Frontal Breakthrough, all received A+1 level bonus. Soon, Strength Burst 10+1, White Raven Sword Art 5+1, and Frontal Breakthrough 5+1. When Strength Burst reached level 10, Strength Burst would receive a Master's bonus. It would consume 3 times the stamina in the next action and receive 10% and 15-ounce bonus. The White Raven Sword style and Frontal Assault were enhanced by Specialist. Brando swung his sword to the left, and the wind pressure left his sword with a whoosh. However, the wind pressure did not form a complete crescent like before. Instead, it formed a giant net. As it moved forward, the giant net passed through the middle of the courtyard. The scaly blades reflected the light in the air and shone brightly as they tore through layers of vortexes. The two of them stared blankly at the tree that was riddled with holes and had only a bare trunk left. Shredded leaves fluttered and fell to the ground. "Damn it, it's an AoE attack," Brando cursed in his heart. "Why didn't I know about this before? Does the Erewhon Palace still have this kind of skill?" "My lord," Falern hugged her book and blinked her eyes, "is this the palace's sword art?" "It's just a coincidence," Brando replied. He sheathed his sword and saw 2 figures, one red and one white, rushing over. Scarlet and Medisha were resting in the room next door when they heard the wind pressure explosion created by Brando. They were startled when they saw Brando and Falern standing in the corridor. They looked at each other and asked in unison, "What's wrong, my lord?" "It's nothing. I'm just practicing my swordsmanship," Brando replied. The red-haired girl frowned as she looked at the old tree in the courtyard. She liked the tree because it gave her an inexplicable sense of tranquility. Just like the leaf she wore on her head, it always gave her a sense of security. She opened her mouth but couldn't find a way to reprimand Brando. She could only give him a dissatisfied look. Brando looked at the red-haired girl, but he didn't see the dissatisfaction in her eyes. "All right, Scarlet. Let's go out for a walk." "Where?" The red-haired girl loosened her grip on her spear. "We'll go to Abyss first, then we'll leave the city." "Just us." "We'll probably need to bring Cornelius and the others as well," Brando replied. "What about me?" Medisha placed her hand on her chest and asked seriously, "Should I go with you, my lord?" "You stay in the city, Medisha." Brando looked at her and shook his head. The undead didn't go far after they retreated. "I need to leave some people in the city to prevent them from taking advantage of the situation. Although it's a waste to fight a war without a purpose, the situation on the battlefield is ever-changing. I need to be prepared. You and the Shire will stay in the city. The 2 of you should be enough to deal with the undead." The Silver Fairy Princess wasn't surprised. She nodded quietly and returned to her original position. Scarlet looked at her and thought of something, but she didn't say anything. She lowered her spear and walked to Brando's side. "So where are we going, my lord?" "The dungeon." "The dungeon?" The dungeon of Coldwood Castle was exactly what most people imagined it to be. It was dark, gloomy, and there was a rotten stench in the air. Occasionally, a rat would run across the uneven stone floor, often bigger than a cat. Abbey's castle was built in the year of the green, about 240 years ago. At that time, Erwin still had to deal with threats from the borders, so the dungeon was built to imprison barbarians who were captured during the war. But today it was mostly used to deal with those who couldn't pay the taxes. Poor people, poachers, and nobles who offended Grodin were all casually charged with a crime. Sometimes even this step was skipped and thrown into the dungeon. This kind of dark days usually lasted for a few years in prison. Aween's criminal law was enacted during the kingdom's most difficult period, and the provisions for the lower classes had not been amended for centuries, so it was extremely harsh. In fact, there were many people who died of illness in the dungeon of Abbey's castle. After a night of fighting, Brando ordered Amandina to release most of the peasants who couldn't pay the taxes. The usually crowded dungeon was unusually quiet at this moment. The sound of footsteps could be heard in the silent darkness, occasionally colliding with the iron chains that hung from the ceiling. Bosley's sharp senses caught the sound of the footsteps. Someone's coming. The old man calmed his breathing. The footsteps were steady and strong, and they were moving at a steady pace. It didn't seem like the messy footsteps of the prison guards. Moreover, the guards in the dungeon seemed to have changed since last night. The footsteps of the newcomers were also different. They seemed more like soldiers who were trained in the battlefield, steady and capable, but there was a slight difference. His eyebrows twitched slightly. The footsteps were getting closer. Bosley had interacted with soldiers for half of his life, and he had an instinctive sense for people who were filled with killing intent. He heard the footsteps coming to a stop not too far away, and then a clattering sound could be heard in the darkness. It was the person opening the door. The door led to this area, and the old man knew that he was the only prisoner in this area. He couldn't help but think to himself, "Is the person looking for me?" His heart pounded violently. The iron chains fell to the ground with a clatter. Not long after, the first ray of light shone through the corner and into his cell. Bosley stared greedily at the ray of light. Tears flowed from his eyes, but he didn't move an inch. He couldn't remember how long it had been since he last saw light. He didn't even know the son after he was captured. Did they change their lord? But there's no good person in the Diener family. He snorted lightly in his heart. The flickering light from the torch finally shone into his cell. Bosley moved slightly and lowered his head, allowing his messy hair to cover his face. But after a while, he heard the gentle voice of a young man. The voice was like a clap of thunder, and he couldn't help but raise his head. "Bosley Houston, Lord of Jincheng Royal Faction. Didn't you die during Everton's rebellion?" Bosley raised his head as if he was under a spell. His body was stiff, and his face was pale as he stared at the young man who he had never seen before. The light from the torch in the young man's hand caused him to shrink back, but he couldn't help but ask in a hoarse voice, "Who are you?" Brando wasn't wrong. He was Bosley Houston, Lord of Jincheng. The royal faction suffered a crushing defeat in the last war. Even the leader of the royal faction, the Earth Knight, Duke Everton, was implicated and imprisoned, let alone a small character like Bosley. When he escaped from the capital, he lied that he had died during the night of the rebellion. But because he wasn't an important character in the royal faction, he was able to escape death. After that, he came to the border of the kingdom and concealed his identity, waiting for the day when the royal faction would rise again. He never thought that he would offend Grodin over a small matter and be thrown into this dark prison. He thought that he would spend the rest of his life in this prison because no one would care about a small character like him. However, he never thought that there would be a day when someone in this dark prison would call out his true identity. Even Grodin didn't know his true identity. It wasn't just him. When Brando spoke, even Falerne and Scarlet looked at him in surprise. It was as if this young lord had always given them curious glances. The two girls were puzzled because he seemed to know people everywhere. A person with vast knowledge could be said to have a good memory. Furthermore, he had such a wide range of connections. He was only in his early 20s, and in their eyes he was close to a monster. Unless it was as Amandina had guessed, there was an unimaginably large family behind him. But Brando only smiled. "It doesn't matter who I am. I'm not part of the royal faction, nor am I part of Duke Erek's people. Furthermore, I have nothing to do with the Randner family." The old man who was sitting cross-legged in the cell like a beggar was slightly startled. He looked at Brendel in confusion. Then you can think of me as a faction of my own, Grandmaster Bosley. Brando took the water bag from the mercenary behind him and handed it to the old man. But my goal is the same as yours. The old man looked at him with gratitude. Brando's action made him feel more at ease. He took a sip from the water bag and asked, "What do you mean?" "Erwin of Zhongxing." "Erwin of Zhongxing?" Bosley looked at the young man suspiciously. He put down the water bag with his withered hand that resembled a tree branch. "If that's the case, why don't you join the royal faction and help the Covardo royal family?" He suddenly stopped and looked at the young man carefully. "Or, are you on the side of House Cipher?" Brando shook his head. "I have my own position and I have my own methods. But that's not important. I'm here to ask you to join me. What can an old man like me help you with?" The old man's eyes flashed as he asked sharply. "Grandmaster Bosley, you're Erwin's master craftsman. You're an expert in armor and smithing. Am I right?" Brando asked. "You want to raise a private army?" Bosley's eyes darkened. "Something like that." Dividing Line. Eking Shinjuju's latest masterpiece, Thief Chow, book number 15090007. The Three Kingdoms again. However, the main character this time was not Dong Feifei, who had killed many people. Fine, I'll admit it. I love Cao Cao in the Three Kingdoms. I hate Uncle Lu and Sun Zhongmo the most. This book tells the story of Thief Chow. It's not Chow Pai, Chow Ji, or Chow Anmin. It's just like a hot-blooded villain, but I'll try to add in some new material. It's not just about fighting for hegemony. It's actually quite interesting to see one's father become a dragon. It's a bit refreshing. I hope everyone will like this book like Thief Chow. The rolling waters of the Yangtze River flow to the east, washing away all heroes. Right and wrong, success and failure vanish in a blink of an eye. The green hills are still there and the sun is still setting. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Chapter 249. But I'm a member of the royal faction. The old man shook his head. "My lord, do you think I'll agree to this?" He raised the water skin in his hand. "Or do you think you can convince me with this little bit of kindness?" "Grandmaster, why don't you let me finish?" Brendel replied, "Different things have different meanings when placed in different situations. Blindly not changing is the path to self-destruction. I'm sure Grandmaster Bosley has personally experienced Sir Everton's lesson." The old man snorted softly. "Then tell me, young man." "Less than 2 weeks ago, with the support of Queen Anna, the eldest son of the royal family announced his succession," Brando replied. "Other than House Cipher, Marquis Kluge of the Thorny Flower and his men are also supporting him. Even though Master Bosley has been imprisoned for more than 3 years, you should know who these people are, right?" "Ah!" Bosley exclaimed. "How could Kluge be in control of the kingdom? What are Lord Aberbeck and his men doing?" He suddenly stopped. "What about His Majesty?" Brando did not answer and only looked at him. The old man was slightly stunned. His white hair trembled and the wrinkles on his face deepened. He looked like he had aged 10 years in an instant. How could this be? Wouldn't our efforts be in vain?" He muttered to himself for a long while, but as someone who had been through a lot, he finally calmed himself down and asked, "All right, Lord Aberbeck is definitely not a mediocre person. Tell me, my lord. There must be another reason why they allowed that clown Kluge to take advantage of them, right?" Brando nodded. But in his heart, he thought that Marquis Kluge of the Thorny Flower was not a clown. He was one of the core members of All for One. How could he be a mediocre person? But even so, he still narrated the series of events that happened since the War of the Black Rose. From his narration, the meaning of this war became completely different, because at this moment, no one in the entire Aoi knew better than him what kind of earth-shattering changes were happening in the neighboring Kingdom of Darkness. "You mean Madara's invasion?" "Exactly." Bosley's expression turned ugly, and he finally raised his hand to interrupt. "So you're saying that everything is related to the Mercury Staff?" A glint flashed in the old man's eyes. "You're saying that the Mercury Staff has resurfaced? Loki's Mercury Staff?" Brando was surprised. He did not expect this master craftsman to know about this. The legend of the Mercury Staff was not widely spread in the human world. Even in the game, Erwin and the other human players only figured out the background story and missions of the Mercury Staff in the second year. "You know about this staff?" Brando asked. "Grandmaster Bosley?" "Of course," Bosley replied. He suddenly patted the dust off his chest and stood up. Although he was a little unsteady, he still stood up shakily. Not only do I know about the Mercury Staff, I also know where the legendary Staff of Darkness came from. Brando's eyes flashed with a hint of surprise. He had never heard of the origin of the Mercury Staff even in the game. He only knew that the first time this divine weapon appeared was in Loki's hands, and after countless years of silence, it reappeared in Madara's land where darkness grew. But as for its history and whether it once belonged to the god, he had no idea. What surprised him was that he didn't expect there to be an additional plot. However, he didn't know how much this master craftsman knew. There's more than one Mercury scepter. Bosley's words caused Brendel to freeze to the spot as if he was petrified. What? Actually, it's a set of divine artifacts, the master craftsman said calmly. I used to think that it was just a legend. But today, my lord, you said that the Mercury scepter has reappeared in the world. Then it's very likely that the legend is becoming a reality. So, the next one? He paused for a moment and raised his head to look at the young man. His cloudy eyes seemed to have become unusually bright. The fire scepter? Brando was slightly taken aback. What's that? The doubt in his heart grew. He was confident that he was knowledgeable enough in the game, but he had no idea what the master craftsman was talking about. He did not even have the slightest impression of what it was. It was reasonable to say that once a treasure of this level appeared, it would cause an uproar, just like the Mercury Staff. Although Madara kept the news under wraps, it only took a year for it to be confirmed among the players. My lord, have you heard of the legend of the four sages? Of course, Brando nodded. The Flame King Gretel, the Wind Empress Saint Tassol, the High Priest Fanzan, and the Saint Eloranta. How could I not know? Bosley's eyes flashed, as if his gaze had traveled back 1,000 years to the era of the War of the Holy Saints. He said in a nostalgic tone, Gretel, Saint Tassol, Fanzan, and Eloranta had obtained the recognition of the ancient kings in order to defeat the Dark Dragon. He turned back. This is an event recorded in the Cruz's epic poem of creation, the Poem of the Heavens. My lord, you should know about it, right? The four hermits defeated the Emperor in the darkness, Brendel muttered subconsciously. However, he was suddenly startled. In the darkness, under the bright full moon, a pitch-black tower extended into the sky appeared before his eyes. He felt as if he was standing on a vast land, looking up at the endless tower that pierced straight into the clouds. It was as if a sense of insignificance arose spontaneously. He could not help but shake his head to shake the illusion out of his mind, and then his whole person returned to reality. My lord. Scarlet asked softly when she saw the fine beads of sweat on Brando's forehead that glistened under the light of the torch. But Brando shook his head, indicating that there was nothing wrong. He took a deep breath. His heart was vaguely doubtful, but he only asked, I know, and then? Bosley glanced at him. The four hermits took out 4 divine artifacts from the valleys of the ancient kings. They are the Scepter of Flame, Odorfice. Wait, Brando shouted, Odorfice? Isn't that the Flame King Gretel's sword, the full name of the Sword of Flame? When he saw the master craftsman looking at him without moving, he suddenly reacted. He could not help but subconsciously look at the ring of the Wind Empress on his hand. So, the Hydra Ring of the Wind Empress, the divine power of Aramisol, the Holy Spear of the Void, these are? Bosley nodded. The young lord was silent for a moment. How did you know this, Grandmaster Bosley? Bosley looked at him and whispered, My lord, do you think this old man can trust you? Brando paused for a moment, then sighed and nodded, I understand. But Grandmaster Bosley, what do you think of my previous proposal? Before that, I have a question, my lord, Bosley replied. Since you know what the Staff of Mercury represents, and that Erwin is walking on the edge of a cliff, why do you have the confidence to revive Erwin? I don't have the confidence, Brando replied without hesitation. But that's not important. After the War of the Black Roses, Erwin's civil war is on the verge of breaking out. But now, I have decided to side with the Corvado royal family. Duke Arek is about to announce his support for the Crown Prince, and the princess is in a precarious situation. I hope to lend her a helping hand. Even if you call me a member of the royal family, it doesn't matter. Bosley looked at him in confusion. If that's the case, why don't you join us? Don't you understand the principle of strength in numbers? I've said it before, Brando replied. I have my own position and I have my own way of doing things. Forgive me for being blunt, but I don't quite understand. Bosley shook his head. Mortals have their own motives, but what about you, my lord? My motive? The young lord smiled. My motive is... If I don't do anything, why would I come here? Bosley was taken aback. He didn't understand Brando's words, or perhaps he would never understand the meaning behind Brando's words. He carefully looked at the young man and slowly said, "Even so, what do you want an old man with one foot in the grave like me to do for you, sir? If it can help the Corvado royal family, this old servant will go through fire and water without hesitation. But then again, if my lord wants to raise a private army, I'm sure you don't lack a blacksmith like me." He paused for a moment. "As far as I know, there are no less than 5 specialized workshops in Abes. As the lord of the kingdom, I'm sure you won't have a headache over such a small matter, right?" Brando looked at the stubborn old man and felt a headache coming on. He couldn't understand how the rotten Corvado royal family could still have such loyal subjects. But he also understood that his foundation was still shallow. He could only say that he was on the princess's side, so he shook his head. "Grandmaster Bosley, normal armors aren't hard to obtain. But Erwin's white lion armor. Only a royal blacksmith like you would know how to make it, am I right?" White lion armor. Bosley looked at Brando in disbelief. "Erwin's light swordsman? You want to form a proper army?" Brando nodded, but he suddenly frowned. He felt the philosopher's stone in his pocket vibrate again. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.gdn.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 250. Terst looked up and saw that the forest in front of him was a mottled, dreamy green. 37 knights were lying on the ground around him. Their corpses lay quietly among the piles of dead leaves. They had long lost all signs of life. The young Viscount could feel the pain from the sword wound under his ribs, and every time he breathed in, he felt a prickling sensation that made him dizzy. He saw a green knight behind a chestnut tree looking at him coldly from the darkness like a ghost. Terst's head spun as he realized that he had been tricked. However, the information came from within the unifying guild, and the letter from Medshk, the commander of the Silver-Winged Cavalry, had the Krite seal on it as well. Unless that damned cavalry commander was a traitor, Terst sighed and cursed in his heart. His hand subconsciously reached for his sword that had been knocked away. It was a subconscious action. Even when he was at his peak, he had only exchanged a single blow with the knight covered in emerald armor and was severely injured. That kind of power was unpredictable, and the most unbearable thing for him was that the other party did not even have the power to activate his elemental power. He defeated him with just a simple sword technique. Terst glanced at the white stone altar in the middle of the clearing, where a simple longsword was placed. The hilt of the longsword was engraved with a red and gold pattern, and on it were the images of 3 unknown heroes. It was the Lionheart sword, the legendary sword that contained the benevolence, valor, and justice of kings. However, there was still the motionless Knight of the Lake in between him and the sword. It was as if there was a chasm between them. The Knight of the Lake stood silently in the middle of the forest, obeying the ancient knight's teachings to not attack those who had lost their ability to move. A normal person would have wisely chosen to retreat, but Terst sneered and continued to crawl forward. Even with the sword wounds on his thigh, abdomen, and ribs making it impossible for him to stand, the young Viscount was still able to move forward inch by inch with his 2 hands. Terst knew that he did not have long to live, but even if he was going to die, he wanted to die closer to his target than the others. As the bastard son of the Duke of Grinoires, he had been brought up to understand the fickleness of human nature. If nothing could be relied on, he had to rely on himself. If he was weak, he would lose everything. He had slowly gained his current position because of this kind of ambition. Even if he had to pay the price of his life, he would still fight against his ambition. The young Viscount clenched his teeth and crawled. He did not know when the Knight of the Lake sword would pierce his heart, or he would die from excessive blood loss. But what he didn't expect was that the knight covered in a layer of emerald armor only glanced at him with his eyes under the metal mask, then put away his sword and left without saying a word. What was going on? Terst was taken aback, but he didn't let go of this opportunity and immediately crawled forward. No matter what, this opportunity would not come again. Even if he had to die, he had to retrieve the sword from the altar. He felt that he was getting closer and closer to the white stone altar, and the distance between him and the sword was closing. Finally, he was able to reach for the hilt. But the moment he touched the Lionheart, a warm current flowed through his body. He could feel his body becoming more active, as if every pore on his body had opened up. His wounds started to itch as they healed faster. However, the young Viscount was slightly startled. He lowered his head and discovered that apart from the bloodstain on his chest, the wound under his ribs had already disappeared without a trace. A holy sword. Terst took a deep breath and knelt down with great difficulty. He examined the sword in his hand carefully. But to his surprise, the lion heart in his hand started to emit a faint light that healed the wounds on his body. But in the next moment, the light on the sword quickly faded. Then it turned into stone. The young Viscount was so shocked that he almost threw the stone sword away. However, when he calmed himself down and carefully stroked the sword with his hand, he could no longer feel the ripples of mana. It was as if he was really holding an ice-cold stone in his hand. Other than its shape, it was no different from any other stone in the forest. What's going on? Terst, who had just survived the ordeal, looked at the sword in bewilderment. From what he saw before, this should be the Lionheart sword, but why did it suddenly turn into stone? He held the sword with both hands and felt an inexplicable feeling in his heart. Even though it was just a piece of stone, there was a vague feeling that it was resisting him. It was as if the sword was in his hand, but it didn't feel like it was there. Terst gripped the stone sword tightly and looked around. The forest behind the rock wasn't that big, and they had already searched every inch of it. There shouldn't be anything else here. From the looks of it, the sword in his hand shouldn't be a fake. However, why did it become like this? This wasn't something he could figure out in a short period of time. He only muttered to himself for a moment before deciding to take this thing out of here first. But before he left, he couldn't help but look back carefully. The Knight of the Lake was probably hiding in the shadows of the forest, staring at him coldly. Terst sighed in relief when he saw that the knight didn't appear again. What an unlucky trip. Terst couldn't help but shake his head. He didn't even look at the corpses on the ground. Instead, he hugged his sword and walked past the corpses of the knights as he staggered out of the forest. The humming sound of the sage slate finally stopped in Brando's hand. He had never seen the sage slate resonate for such a long time before. Everyone in the dungeon stared at the mysterious rune in Brendel's hand for a while. It was only when it stopped for a long time that they turned their attention back to Brendel. The prison fell silent, with only the sound of dripping water coming from a distance. This must be a bound sage slate, my lord. Even though Bosley was currently a prisoner and Brendel's temporary retainer, he stood in front of the young lord with a neither servile nor overbearing attitude. It was as if he wanted to show that he was only temporarily relying on the royal faction and that he could return to the royal faction in the future. But what surprised him was that Brando didn't seem to care about this. Bosley was surprised and puzzled. Compared to the uncertainty in his heart, he felt that it would be better if this young man locked him up again. However, freedom was hard to come by. Just the warmth of the torches made him want to breathe in more air, so he wouldn't say such words again. Brando looked at the old man and nodded. You know him? He asked. Brando didn't care about Bosley's attitude because he wasn't a noble. He had been a leader of a guild, but he had never been a lord. Even though he was in this position, he didn't have the self-awareness. It was just that he didn't notice it. However, his attitude was unanimously approved by his followers. Even Amandina had to admit that Brando's amiable attitude made the group feel more cohesive. Moreover, the young man always exuded a strong self-confidence that was enough to motivate others to follow him. Even the noble ladies couldn't help but think that perhaps this was the so-called unique charm. Brando's curious gaze landed on Bosley. The philosopher's slate was described in the Cruise's creation myth, Poem of the Blue, and the mountain people's ancient records, Howling Wind. The Myrna people and the witches believed that it was a fragment of a star that fell to the earth because it could connect with the threads of fate in the sky. In fact, the mortals knew a lot about the philosopher's slate for thousands of years. Xingjian also used it for divination. The method was to connect the philosopher's slate with something, then she could accurately predict the direction of the thing related to it. The stone sage also used the same method to foresee the future. As long as the philosopher's slate was placed on the stone sage's body, the player would be able to obtain the answer in their heart. This was the legend of the people, and the players had personally confirmed that there was such a setting in the game. However, the master craftsman was able to see that the philosopher's slate was bound to him. This wasn't simple. Not everyone knew about runes, especially since the philosopher's slate was one of the oldest runes in the game. As a royal craftsman, it was understandable that he had heard about the legends of the divine artifacts, but it was strange that he was proficient in ancient runes. After all, even the craftsmen of Buga were not proficient in runes. Brando stopped and looked at Bosley, but he didn't rule out the possibility that the master craftsman was just guessing. He asked, Indeed. But can you tell what the philosopher's slate points to? Brando's question was a little difficult because even he didn't know what the philosopher's slate meant. At most, he guessed that it had something to do with the Lionheart. That is. Bosley suddenly stopped and his face turned serious. Brando saw the master craftsman's hands trembling as he stared at the philosopher's slate. The sage, the emblem of a king, valor, justice, and mercy. How? He took a deep breath and couldn't help but look at the philosopher's slate again, but the more he looked, the more serious his expression became. In the end he couldn't take it anymore and took a step back. He looked up at Brando in disbelief and asked tentatively, "The Lionheart sword?" Brando's expression soon became even more surprised than him. Scarlet exclaimed. Even though she didn't know what the sage slate was or what magical runes were, as a citizen of Erewhon, the most famous story she had heard since she was young was the story of King Eric and his Lionheart sword. She immediately turned her head back as if she wanted to get confirmation from the young man's face, but she heard Brando ask in a hoarse voice, "How did you know?" If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.gdn.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 251. The dungeon was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Falerne looked at the old man suspiciously while the others were speechless. It really is the Lionheart. Bosley muttered to himself and took a step back. How is this possible? How is this possible? King Eric once said that if one day his descendants forgot his glory, the Lionheart would be lost as well. The royal faction gathered together to reclaim our lost glory, but why is the Lionheart linked to your fate, my lord? Grandmaster Bosley. Brando put away the philosopher's stone and looked at the confused old man. He found it hard to connect the old man to the royal faction's chief craftsman. However, the information on the forums was never wrong. Even though the old man was a little strange, he had already shown the ability to surprise Brando. Brando was surprised that the chief craftsman of Erewhon knew runes. You know something about the Lionheart, right? Bosley stopped and calmed down after hearing the question. He looked at the young lord and knew that he could not hide anything from him, but he was still in a difficult position. My lord, this is a secret. My family once swore an oath. Brando waved his hand impatiently. I can guess what you mean. I know that the Toots have always served the royal faction. However, King Eric of Erewhon swore an oath on the Lionheart. He said that anyone who betrayed his oath would be abandoned by the Lionheart. However, when the Lionheart returns to Erewhon, it will return with glory, no matter who it is or when it appears. Because of King Eric's oath, the Lionheart has always been closely linked to the fate of this kingdom. However, because the Lionheart has inherited King Eric's will, it can choose the one who brings the glory. He stopped and looked at the old man in front of him with his light brown eyes. The meaning in his gaze was clear. You are a member of the royal faction, but the royal faction's efforts are not only for the sake of the royal faction's power. If you want to reclaim your lost glory, you must walk the path of King Eric. Only when the flames of the past burn this dusty land can this ancient kingdom be reborn. Brando didn't say anything, but he gave Bosley a choice. There was one more thing that Brendel did not say, because from this moment on, he was already standing on the same path as the stubborn and brave princess. Although she did not succeed in the previous history, this time he wanted to personally clear the thorns on her path, and Erewhon would obtain a true new life from the flames. It was as if history had split into two straight lines in front of him at this moment, one of which led to the burning palaces and cities in the flames. Kingdoms were overturned, the earth bore the burden of suffering, and the living beings suffered in the flames, never to see the light of day again. As for where the other path led to, he did not know. Perhaps there were difficulties lurking on that path, and the thorns were soaked in blood. But no matter what, at least there was a glimmer of hope in the deepest darkness. The old man lowered his head and hesitated for a moment, but in the end he chose to compromise. He sighed and said, "You're right, my lord. No matter who has the sword, at least the ancient legends will not be wrong. I just didn't expect Erewhon's path to glory to return to this ancient kingdom by burning the earth. Perhaps we have fallen too far." He raised his head and looked into Brando's eyes. "My lord, you know that there are some families in Erewhon with a long history, but not all of them can be traced back to the era of King Eric. The Cipher dynasty and the Corvado dynasty both created and destroyed a group of noble lineages." He paused for a moment. "But there are some unknown small families that have been passed down from generation to generation since the ancient times." Master Craftsman's tone became a little proud. "The Tugos family is one of them. Although our family is not well known, Our ancestors were the attendants of King Eric and were blacksmiths in the army. Generation after generation our family served the royal family. The craftsmanship of the white lion armor was indeed invented by us. Later on, our family supported the Corvado royal family until today. Brando nodded. He knew this history, but at least he knew that Bosley was not lying to him. But in fact, not only was my ancestor an attendant of King Eric, but he was also one of the 5 attendants who brought the Lionheart sword from the Eagle Empire of Cruz. Bosley's voice became deeper. But many people don't know the true identity of the Lionheart sword. Most legends say that the Lionheart sword is one of the 4 sacred relics of Cruz. But most people in Cruz probably don't know that the 4 sacred relics were originally one. Brando's eyes flashed as if he had thought of something. So? He asked. When the 4 sacred relics were combined, they were called Odorfice or the Scepter of Flames. Most people call it the Flaming Blade, the Sword of King Gretel, Bosley said, emphasizing each word. A true divine artifact. Brando's body suddenly swayed. He stuttered for the first time, Master Bosley, the resonance between the Sage Slate and the Lionheart sword. Could it be a divine artifact? Of course not. Bosley shook his head. The Lionheart sword may be a divine artifact, but it's only a divine artifact. The difference between a divine artifact and a divine artifact isn't as simple as a few words. Although I've never come into contact with a divine artifact before from the ancient records, the difference between the two is incalculable. Then is there a possibility that the Lionheart sword was sanctified by King Eric's oath, and after so many years of accumulation, it became a divine artifact? Brando asked again. Bosley shook his head again. My lord, I suggest that you put away your unrealistic imagination. I'll say the same thing again. Once you see the difference between a divine artifact and a divine artifact, you'll understand how naive and laughable your thoughts are. When it came to the knowledge of these treasures, the master craftsman was filled with unquestionable confidence. However, he quickly realized that he had offended Grodin and was sent to prison. He quickly lowered his head in apology, but his heart was filled with regret. Unfortunately, his actions were destined to be in vain. Brando didn't have the time to think about these minor details. He felt his vision turning dark, and he finally understood why he resonated with the Lionheart sword that day. It wasn't just the resonance between him and the Lionheart sword, but also the prophecy that Bosley had told him. He could guess what kind of good deed he had done. The flaming scepter. It was the flaming scepter that resonated with him. It was the flaming blade, Odorfice, that King of Flames Gretel once wielded. Oh my God, Martha. Brando couldn't help but groan in his heart. What kind of joke is this? But I didn't hear anything about Odorfice's reappearance in the Amber Sword. Even the Lionheart sword disappeared without a trace. According to Bosley's prophecy, history must have changed there. But where did it change? Brando couldn't help but rub his temples. All right, he shook his head. Let's end this topic here, Grandmaster Bosley. I don't want these words to spread. He paused for a moment. I'm sure you don't want everyone to know that the Lionheart sword has chosen me. Am I right? Bosley looked at him doubtfully. The Lionheart sword is Erwin's legitimate weapon. Because of Erwin's oath, he can use it to proclaim himself as the king. In fact, when the Corvado dynasty was first established, they used the name of the Lionheart sword. But most of the people didn't know that the Lionheart sword was lost. If this matter was made public, it would shake the royal family's influence. Bosley couldn't figure out why this young man would take the initiative to hide this fact. Could it be that he really supports the princess? When Bosley was imprisoned, the princess was not even 12 years old. Of course, he couldn't figure out Brando's background. But no matter what, he was still skeptical of Brando's words. In the end, Bosley nodded. No matter what, he didn't want the royal family's reputation to be tarnished. He had dedicated half of his life to the Corvado royal family. He spent the most blood-boiling time as a member of the royal faction. Even if he lost in the end, he had no regrets. That was why no matter how correct Brando's words were, he wouldn't side with him. He just hoped that Brando wouldn't go back on his words. Like he said, he would help the princess. If the eldest son of the king had the backing of the All-for-One and the restoration of the Cipher dynasty, then the princess would be the only source of support for the Corvado dynasty. Bosley didn't have a choice. He lowered his head and sighed. My lord, I'm willing to contribute the craftsmanship of the White Lion armor. But if my lord wants to train light swordsmen, I'm afraid that equipment alone is far from enough. Although the White Lion armor is the core of this unit, but... Brando's face was hidden in the shadows of the torches. He smiled faintly. The White Lion Swordsman is Erewhon's first-rank unit. It became famous in the battle against the Cruz Empire in Valnoja. It's known for its outstanding speed and defensive capabilities. Its core is the White Lion armor's outstanding ability. But this armor is based on the design of the half-plate of the Wind Empress. On the other hand, although the White Lion armor is complicated, it's not irreplaceable. Bosley looked at him, his mouth wide open. You know about the White Lion armor? Brando glanced at him. What's there to know about an inferior battle technique? When the late King Eric broke away from the Cruz Empire, there was the shadow of the Saint-Tassol Empire behind him. Otherwise, do you think that Erewhon alone could fight Cruz to a draw? If it wasn't for Eric's vow not to break away from the Holy Cathedral of Fire, it might have turned into a war between the two holy cathedrals. The first holy war recorded in history would have happened hundreds of years earlier. He smiled. It's just that the Holy Cathedral of Wind didn't do it right. Whether it's the White Lion armor or the White Lion armor, it's too different from its original. It turned a third-rank unit into a first-rank unit. Bosley's expression changed. He had heard of these secrets before, but it sounded different when it came from this unfamiliar young man. My lord, you mean? The original version of the White Lion Swordsman was originally the White-Winged Knight of the Wind Elves, one of the Wind Elves' Imperial Guards. It's just that it's too small. He smiled again. But although the White Lion armor is one of the biggest secrets of the Erewhon Empire, it's not worth mentioning to me. If you can forge a batch of White Lion armor in the shortest time possible, I'll give you a surprise. Brando laughed inwardly as he said this. Although the White Lion armor was of a lower level, it was impossible for him to find someone within 100 miles who could teach him this technique. Not to mention the whole of Tanajul, even in the whole of the Southern Kingdom, there was probably no one who could learn this technique. After all, it was a secret of the Erewhon Empire, so it was impossible for it to be sold everywhere like cabbages. Just like Bosley, if it weren't for a coincidence, he wouldn't have appeared here. Surprise? The old man naturally couldn't tell that Brando was deliberately mystifying things, so he only asked in confusion. Of course. Bosley frowned. Very well, he replied, but my lord, the White Lion armor is actually a type of enchanted armor? You mean special materials? The old man nodded. So what's missing? Brando asked. As far as I know, Bosley replied, Tanajul doesn't have any high-purity crystal mines, right? If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 252. Indeed, Bosley was right. Tanajul was not rich in crystal ores. In order to create the White Lion armor, the sacred wind runes had to be branded onto the main joints and breastplate of the armor to reduce the weight of the armor and increase its agility. Erewhon's blacksmiths would use amethyst or topaz instead. These two types of crystals were extremely pure magic crystals and were one of the main materials used by witches and astrologers to make crystal balls. In Wond, amethyst was also known as moon quartz, a type of calcite. Grimoires, Erech, Vero, and the east of Tanajul were rich in these crystals. They grew densely in the caves formed by the erosion of the mountains and hills, but Tanajul did not have such natural conditions. Trentheim was an unfamiliar territory to him, and it was an unfamiliar territory to him. The drawbridge creaked as it was lowered, and the chains connecting the drawbridge to the city gate made an ear-piercing sound as they rubbed against the bricks. A ray of light shone in from behind the drawbridge, imprinting itself on the brick wall on one side of the pitch-black gate. Brando sat motionlessly on his horse. His light brown eyes reflected the light that was gradually becoming more and more dazzling. He pursed his lips and looked at the drawbridge that was slowly lowering. The gap between the drawbridge and the gate was getting wider and wider. More and more light was pouring in from behind the gap, illuminating his eyes brightly. Behind him was the main street of Abes. Other than the short speech he gave to the surviving mercenaries and citizens in the morning after the bitter battle that night, this was the first time he observed the city from the perspective of a lord. At least for the time being, this was his own city. Baron Abes' territory was located in the south of Tanajul. It was directly under Grodin's jurisdiction. There were only 4 major populated areas: Abes, the mining town of Shafland, Gree Ferry, and Port Gree to the east. The population was estimated to be around 80,000. 30,000 of them lived in Castle Abes and the surrounding areas. Of course, there were many settlements like the Green Village that were not included in the statistics, but Brando guessed that the total population was less than 100,000. However, this was the most densely populated area in Tanajul. There were about 300,000 people living in Tanajul. Tanajul had a total of 170 knights' territories. Grodin's territory was not the only one. Most of the territories were occupied by his retainers. Brando knew that Saluf was nicknamed the Benevolent Knight. Saluf was a strict and inflexible knight compared to the tyrannical nobles here. Brando knew that the only reason Saluf was able to get along well with Grodin and was entrusted with such an important task was because Saluf had always been loyal to Grodin. Therefore he would have to face the armies of these two lords first. These people were Count Randner's pathfinders, and only by teaching them a lesson would the Count, who was hiding behind the scenes, become more cautious. Therefore their first goal was to make Grodin's retainers fear them in the upcoming battle. The door of the drawbridge creaked as it was lowered. After a flash of white light, Brando saw the blue sky. He raised his head and looked at the sky. From Abi's castle to the Parton wilderness in the north, the Tanajul plains between the Horn Gorge and Mount Greyhar shared the same beautiful weather. This was the best period of time for Randner before winter. The plains shone with a golden luster, but after the autumn harvest the temperature would quickly drop. Thus, the nobles in the north were preparing for war. They wanted to attack before winter. If they delayed, the war would drag on until the next spring. Both Queen Anna and Gluck did not want to see such an outcome. Especially in the Yanalasa region, the Erewhon royal family's Lion Dragon fleet was a huge threat behind Corvado. It could change the situation at any time. Cypher's Black Edge had already entered the Lodel River, and the only thing left was for both sides to persuade the merchants in Ampere Seal. If the Queen's top lobbyists succeeded in persuading the merchants, then thousands of Cypher's heavy infantry would cross the Lodel River and reach the border of Frada, just like what happened in history. Similarly, the situation in Tanajul in the south had also become tense because of his appearance. The smell of war was like the sweetness of a harvest that floated in the wind, but there was also a faint smell of blood. Time moved methodically against a leaden-gray background. The 17th, the second day after the war. According to the communication standards of this era, the letter containing the news of the mercenaries' rebellion should have reached Lord Maxon in the north of Minsk Castle. The first batch of knights should be leaving the limestone castle to gather their forces, Brando thought silently. He could only control the area around Abi's castle, and the knight in the manor had already left with the news. After the initial preparations, Lord Maxon should be able to gather 2,000 or 3,000 soldiers. Although the iron ratio is less than 20%, it will still be a tough battle for the less than 1,000 mercenaries. Lord Maxon probably expects the mercenaries to defend Abi's castle to the death or escape into the forest. However, Brando's ideal location for the battle was the hills north of Gree Ferry. As for when the army would depart, it would depend on the news from the scouts. Before this, he had already sent a small group of mercenaries of Lopez to the latter's territory. At this moment, in Ferber Barony, there was no one more suitable than the Druids to act as spies. Brando thought about all of this in silence. This battle was extremely important in everyone's mind. This was not only because Lord Maxon was about to send out his troops, but also because it was only a small test. Brando's real headache was the possibility of Count Randner closing in on him from behind the scenes. He estimated that he had about a month's time to arrange everything, repair the defenses, and tidy up the territory. Before that, it was more important to build up the mercenaries' confidence in him. Even though the mercenaries in the city were on the same boat as him for the time being, it was impossible for them to be so close to him in the long run. Unless they were confident that he could provide them with the necessary protection. Yuta, Cornelius, and Rabin were not to be trifled with. Brando knew that he would not be able to hold them back with just a beautiful hope. This battle would build up their confidence. In fact, Amandina also believed that this battle was not only for the sake of stabilizing this initial group. At the same time, it was also to announce Brando's legitimacy to the citizens of Abi's castle. If this battle achieved its goal, Count Randner would slow down his pace. This way the citizens would naturally lean towards them. What the citizens needed was not only a benevolent lord, but also a lord who could protect them. The drawbridge was already halfway down, and Brando could see the red tiles on the roofs of Abi's castle in the distance. Tanajul was close to the western coast of the Dead Moon Inland Sea. The wind from the sea brought with it plenty of rain, so most of the houses had extremely sloped roofs. Other than the pointed arched windows in the attics, there was a channel to draw water from the eaves. Green vines hung down from the windows of the attics, contrasting with the red tiles on the roof. Light also poured into the tunnel, brightening it up. Other than his face, the light outlined half of Brendel's body from the darkness, and then drew out the graceful curves of the two beautiful girls behind him. Scarlet carried her long spear on her back and stood upright on her horse. Although her amber eyes deliberately maintained a sense of calmness like a guard, there was a trace of a young girl's anticipation and excitement hidden deep in her heart. After all, she was an independent girl who grew up with the Grey Wolves mercenaries in the mountains of the Southern Territory. Of course, she was not used to the dull atmosphere in the castle. As for Scarlet, most of her emotions were still indifferent. Brando paid attention to his two followers for a moment, then looked forward and calmed his mind. The drawbridge was slowly lowered in front of him, and the scenery on the other side became more and more visible. The streets were still being cleaned, but there were already people on the other side. Most of the shops and workshops were not open for business, but Brendel's sharp senses had already noticed the suspicious and vigilant gazes from the windows on him. The citizens of the castle had already noticed the commotion in Abbey's castle, and they were sizing up this new lord who was not so legitimate. Brando had already ordered Amandina to rewrite the tax policy, and not only did he exempt most of the taxes, but he also cut off the old accounts. Unfortunately, even though this method was tempting, most people were doubtful of how effective it was. Moreover, it was still a question whether he could stand up again. With a loud bang, dust flew everywhere and the drawbridge was finally lowered. Brando smiled in his heart, but he did not care too much about the attitude of these people. Next, he saw Rabin, Yuta, and Cornelius waiting for him outside the castle, and Amandina was standing beside them. "My lord." The silver-haired middle-aged man, Cornelius, was the first to bow deeply when he saw Brendel. As someone who had fought side by side with Brendel before, he knew better than anyone what kind of capabilities this young lord had. Even though he was worried that Brando would not be able to face the Ranner family head-on, or if he would use them as scapegoats, the more worried he was, the more respectful he was. Yuta pursed her lips slightly, but Brando's actions today made her eyes light up. She was surprised that this murderous young man had such an amiable side to him. Rabin was the only one who held his head high with an expressionless face. "Do you know why I'm looking for you?" Brando asked. The three of them shook their heads. "My lord," Cornelius replied respectfully, "just give us your orders, and we will not hesitate to go through fire and water to carry it out." To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 253. When Cornelius lowered his head, the female mercenary commander flicked her fiery red hair and looked at him with dissatisfaction. "Don't drag us down with you." She wanted to say something but she could not find the right words to criticize him. Even though she did not like what the silver-haired middle-aged man said, she had to admit that what he said was true. In fact, when they took that step that night, they already knew the outcome of today's battle. But Brendel was right. After offending one lord, how would they dare to offend another lord? They could only blame themselves for being too impulsive when they were suppressed by Grodin that afternoon, which gave Grodin an excuse to attack them. She could not help but snort softly, but she could not help but look at Cornelius. When they heard about the young lord's new tax policy earlier, these few people looked at each other a little. In Vaunt, the nobles didn't need to buy people's hearts at all. Besides, they also understood that it didn't make much sense to do so. If Brando could fight against Count Randner, then the people would not dare to rebel against him even if he did not do anything. If he did not do anything, then everything would be in vain. However, if they were to collect more taxes, they would at least be able to gain more income in a short period of time. With money, the lord would be able to raise more private soldiers. Does he not understand this? She could not help but think. But of course Brando understood. In fact, the young man was quite familiar with how the territories operated in the Amber Sword. Capital, resources, and construction formed a triangle. The capital came from trade, taxes, and the income from the mines, while resources and population were the core of development. Tonajal was rich in wood and silver. Baron Abies alone had 9 lumber mills and a silver mine. There were also 2 quarries, manors, and workshops. But in reality, other than silver, most of the people in Erewhon were poor. If not for Schaflun's silver mine, Baron Abies would be no different from a beggar in the eyes of the nobles. But this was what Brando despised about Grodin. Even so, he was unwilling to change. Under his management, Tonajal's production was still stuck at Erewhon's level half a century ago. The large city of Abies did not have more than 20 blacksmiths, and this was taking into account the number of apprentices. Not to mention, according to the documents left behind by the previous lord, Abi's castle could not produce more than 10 sets of chainmail or leather armor in a month. One had to know that Awin's magic and technology were not even worth mentioning when compared to those empires that stood at the pinnacle of the continent. Even Trentheim was considered to be inferior in this kingdom, so one could imagine how barren this territory was located at the southern border of the Ranner region. Just like what Sir Samper of the Lantan Island Geographical Society mentioned, the only thing worth mentioning in the south of the kingdom was silver. But it was impossible for all of it to fall into Grodin's hands. Apart from Count Ranner, the royal family and the Holy Cathedral also had to divide a portion equally. In the end, only a small portion would fall into the hands of the poor Baron Abes. But Brando knew that if he acted fast enough, he would be able to fully control Schaflun's silver mine in 2 to 3 months. He could not imagine how much money that was. Even in the game he had never been a lord, let alone manage a mine. Those were already monopolized by the large guilds. In front of the real, professional behemoths, even RMB warriors and face fighters would tremble in fear. Brando guessed that 10 to 20 million Tor coins would not be a problem. With this amount of money, Baron Abes' territory, which did not exceed 270,000 Tor coins a year, would not be a problem for him at all. He asked Amandina to reformulate the tax policy. In principle, it was to buy the people's support by exempting them from taxes, but the real consideration was far more than that. Even though he was already opposing the nobles, he had more reasons to win the support of the common people. But compared to that, he was more concerned about the long-term benefits. What he needed was not only the support of the people but also the population. Lighter taxes were beneficial to the rapid growth of the population, and he needed more people to open up the barren lands. This was a long-term benefit. Not to mention Yuta and the others, even Grodin might not have the patience to achieve all of this. In any case, silver was enough for him. Brando lowered his head and looked at Cornelius, who was bowing respectfully in front of him. "We're going to patrol the territory. Bring your men with you." Oh. Falerne blinked in confusion when she heard this. She knew that Brando was about to face a battle that he had to win. But even at this time, Brendel seemed to want to bring his mercenaries to take back the lumber mills. There was an entire tribe of subterranean dwellers there, and as residents of the lowest level of the Georgindi underworld, the average strength of the subterranean dwellers was at least iron-ranked. Even if Brando was confident in winning, how could he avoid casualties? Were the lumber mills that important? Patrol the territory? Both Falerne and Cornelius were surprised. "Baron Abes has 4 lumber mills and 2 quarries," Brando replied. "Today our mission is to make them our assets." Yuta was surprised. "My lord," she immediately raised her head, "we know about the lumber mills, but they are already occupied by the subterranean dwellers. You're not asking us to take them back, are you?" Brando did not reply and only looked at the few of them. On the other hand, Jana and Cornelius had ugly expressions. They had stayed in the forest for quite some time, and they were familiar with the subterranean dwellers. They liked to fight at night and they were strong. If they really fought, who knew how many of their brothers would die? They had already paid a heavy price in the battle that just ended, and there was a possibility that there would be another difficult battle soon. But at this critical moment, Brando wanted them to participate in a battle that did not seem to be necessary, and they could not accept it. "My lord?" Cornelius raised his head with difficulty. "The subterranean dwellers. They come from the underworld, and their individual strength is comparable to our elites. If we really fight, I'm afraid that we will be at a disadvantage." He licked his lips. "Of course this is not a problem, but I heard that Lord Maxon's army is also gathering." He lowered his voice and thought that Brando would understand his words. Amandina shook her head. "Lord Maxon is Grodin's retainer. Why would he attack us?" The 3 of them stared blankly, wondering if this noble lady had gone crazy or was in a daze. "Isn't it obvious, Miss Amandina?" Yuta replied, "That person is Grodin's retainer and we killed Grodin." She thought for a moment and added, "Furthermore, he has Count Ranner behind him. Even if he doesn't want to move, that old man will definitely pressure him." Amandina nodded. "Well said. That's why our real enemy is Count Ranner, and Lord Maxon is nothing more than a pawn to test the waters. But do you think that with our current strength we are a match for the Count?" Amandina said expressionlessly. The 3 of them looked at each other. In fact, this was what they were most worried about. Amandina purposely ignored the news about the druid and the princess, which made them even more confused. The 3 mercenary leaders could not help but look at Brando. It was not impossible for Brando to hand them over as scapegoats. Brando looked at Amandina. "She's finally catching up with my thoughts." Her growth has been astonishing ever since the battle at Chablis. He raised his head. Amandina's thoughts were the same as his. If he had to expand his territory to the point where even Count Randner would not dare to fight him to the death, he would have to rely on this barren land of Tanajal. It might seem like an impossible task, but that was not the case. He knew that he had Valha, the Druid, and many other variables behind him, not to mention that Amandina had the power of magicite. But the prerequisite for this was not only time but also resources. No matter what, he had to restore the operations of his territory, especially the 4 sawmills and 2 quarries around Castle Abes. He had to get them back into production as soon as possible. The reconstruction of the city walls, the training of the militia, the magicite workshop, and the various workshops all required resources. Once the Roman plan was implemented, Brando had to get these things up and running before he could establish his own merchant guild. That was why he had to end the war with Lord Maxon before the autumn harvest. Once this territory was on the right track, there were too many things he could do. Time was of the essence. Miss Amandina is my aide. Her words represent my words. Brando replied. Amandina's expression softened. My family can guarantee my safety in this war, but it's different for you. I'm not someone who gives up on my subordinates, but everything has its limits. If I lose in this war, then I can imagine what will happen to you. He lowered his voice. That's why we're on the same boat. But this boat isn't just filled with storms, there are also opportunities and treasures. At least compared to Grodin, I consider myself a generous lord. As long as you don't disappoint me, I won't disappoint you. Seeing that Cornelius was still in a daze, he added another sentence. As for the subterranean dwellers, Brando paused for a moment, you should know that the Black Tower of Karsuk fought with the subterranean dwellers for resources in the underworld for 10 years. Rabin raised his head in surprise. My lord, you have a plan? I've always had a plan. Brando replied casually, then added another sentence in his mind, but it has nothing to do with the Black Tower's wizards. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 254. While the 3 commanders were gathering their men, Brando sent someone to find a guide from the slums. When the ragged man was found from the shack in the south of Ferber, he was worried that working for this unfamiliar lord would bring him trouble. Before he came, he had already inquired about what happened in the inner city. The commotion that night was huge, and even if Amandina wanted to hide it, it would be impossible. But he could not resist the temptation of money and his woman's persuasion, and after some hesitation, he agreed to join the group. Because the generous young noble had promised to give him a gold coin as a reward, which he could not earn even if he worked for a year. With this money he could send his child to the workshop in the inner city to be an apprentice. Perhaps the fate of his family would change because of this. When Brando asked, he carefully told him that the forest south of Abes was known as the Forest of the Bearmen. It was not that there were level 65 monsters in the forest that made Brando's scalp tingle, but there were many wild bears in the forest. There were 4 sawmills in the forest, and 3 of them were occupied by the subterranean dwellers. The last sawmill was destroyed and abandoned by the workers. Grodin had sent his private army into the forest to clear out the subterranean dwellers, but after suffering 2 losses, he did not mention it again. Brando nodded after listening to the story. It was as he expected. It had been more than an hour since they left Abes. The further south they went, the more trees they saw in the wilderness. The forest stretched from east to west like a huge shadow in front of the mercenaries. The young man sat on the horse's back and held the reins tightly with one hand. He watched the mercenaries in front of him draw a loose line and enter the forest with black pine trees and red pine trees. Their figures flickered and soon disappeared in the shadows between the trees. A girl's voice interrupted Brando from behind and sighed, "Are the subterranean dwellers that powerful?" Brando raised his eyebrows subconsciously. He did not know how the Roman appeared, but the merchant girl had appeared uninvited not long after they left the city. Speaking of which, wasn't she counting the resources and checking the accounts left behind by the previous lords? The corner of his mouth twitched. So, who told her that she was going to find the subterranean dwellers? "It's true, my lady," the man hurriedly said. "I heard from the guards in the city that they look like rats. Even though they don't have eyes, they can distinguish directions by smell and sound. They're also very strong and fast. Normal people are not their opponents. Even the Baron's subordinates need 2 or 3 people to deal with one subterranean dweller." The Roman tapped her chin with her white finger and raised her head to imagine the subterranean dwellers in her mind. Then don't they have an advantage at night? She muttered to herself. That's right. Amandina looked at Romain with a troubled expression. She was a little embarrassed to tell Brendel that she was actually tricked by the merchant girl into telling her what they were doing with just a few words. She still did not know if the fiancé of the Lord was lucky or if she had been plotting against her from the beginning. But no matter which it was, she could not accept it. Not only at night, but even in the forest where visibility is not high, they have a far greater advantage than us humans. Unless we have an iron-ranked soldier, it is difficult to detect them in advance. She turned to Brando and said, "My lord, we have already entered the forest. Should we send out scouts?" Brando shook his head. He knew very well that the subterranean dwellers had 15 points of strength and 10 points of dexterity. Their strength and dexterity were above average iron-ranked, and normal iron-ranked mercenaries were no match for them. In order to maintain the defense of Abes, I only brought about 4 groups of mercenaries with me this time. I do not intend to divide them further. The young man stared at the forest and replied, "Besides, who do you think is more familiar with this forest than the subterranean dwellers?" When Brando spoke, he unconsciously used the habit of the amber sword. In the game, there were 80 players in a group, so he actually wanted to say 300 people. Amandina did not notice his slip of the tongue. Instead, she was shocked. "Of course it's the subterranean dwellers." Amandina was stunned. "My lord, you mean? We don't need scouts?" But she had never heard of a battle where one side completely gave up on scouting the battlefield. Amandina's dark eyes flashed. "Magic?" she asked tentatively. "Something like that." Brando looked around, and with a slight movement of his mind, the wind spirit spiders crawled out from the ground one by one. The mercenaries were shocked when they saw the green spiders surrounded by whirlwinds suddenly appearing around them. But they had already seen these little creatures when they fought against Madara's undead army, and knew that they were under the command of the young lord in the middle of them. Thus they could be considered as allies. After a short commotion, the crowd quickly calmed down, but they still looked at the center of the group with reverence. In this era of Erewhon, having a gold-ranked wizard under a noble was definitely a symbol of status. Even Duke Arek and Duke Karsuk, who ruled over a region, only had 2 or 3 gold-ranked wizards as their aides. But Brando was the descendant of a noble family, and not only did he have a gold-ranked wizard accompanying him, the Shire had become the natural leader of the spellcasters under Brando's command in Abes. Naturally, he was known by all the young followers. Not only that, he was also a gold-ranked swordsman, and he had Medisha and Scarlet, who were both gold-ranked rank 1 as his subordinates. Even Count Randner's elite forces were only at this level. One must know that the girl called Medisa was a legendary silver elf. The silver elves had not appeared in this land for centuries. Their sudden appearance in the eyes of the people could only imagine the shock it caused. Not to mention the rumors of Brando's close relationship with the silver elves, even Yuta, Rabin, and Cornelius felt that they could not see through this young man. It was also because of this that they decided to stay and fight against the Randner family together with Brando. Otherwise, with just Brando's status as a viscount, they would rather fall into the dark forest. At the very least, there was still a chance of survival if they chose the latter path. Brando naturally heard of these rumors, and he also knew that these rumors were spread by the Roman and Amandina. The meticulousness of a noble's daughter and the novelty of a young Roman's mind combined together resulted in all sorts of strange ideas. He would not clarify this matter since this was the effect he wanted to achieve. This was what he had done in the past, but now his 2 subordinates had learned from him. Brando did not say a word as he took out the holy sword cards from his chest. In the next moment, the dragon knights that displayed their might against Madara's undead army appeared in front of the mercenaries once again. This was the second time Brando used this set of cards in front of others. Yuta, Cornelius, and Rabin's expressions changed when they saw this. They originally thought that the wind spirit spiders were Brando's magical pets, but they did not expect it to be a spell. As for the strength of this spell, it was not easy to measure it. If it was used properly, it would not be impossible for it to defeat a gold-ranked being. According to the common classification of spells, this spell was at least gold-ranked. However, they all knew that Brando was a swordsman. A gold-ranked swordsman. It seemed like he was also a gold-ranked summoner. This was a little inconceivable. Brando waved his hand and gave an order in his mind: surround the forest as far as possible and kill all non-human creatures. The subterranean dwellers must have sentries around the forest, and he had to remove them. Although he did not expect the subterranean dwellers to not realize that the human army had entered the forest, he had to at least buy some time. Then he raised his head and silently watched the wind spirit spiders spread out their whirlwinds and flew into the sky one by one, leaving streaks of green light behind them as they flew towards the forest. He then turned around and saw the night song tiger looking away from the forest. "My lord, how do you plan to fight this battle?" The night song tiger turned around and asked, "If the information is correct, there are thousands of subterranean dwellers in the forest. Their numbers are several times that of ours, and their individual strength is much higher than ours. To be honest, I don't know how to fight this battle." "Don't be afraid before the battle," Scarlet replied from behind, "Captain Nightsong." "Captain." The Nightsong tiger was stunned for a moment before he reacted. He chuckled and looked at Brando. "Miss Scarlet, are you sure you want to join us?" The red-haired girl nodded nonchalantly and looked at Brando. "I've thought about it, but I don't have anywhere else to go." "I'm sorry." "It's fine." Scarlet smiled nonchalantly. "Let's listen to what my lord has in mind. I'm also curious about how we should fight this battle. Back when Captain Makarov was leading the Grey Wolves mercenaries, we were only able to defeat an enemy twice our size, but that was just a bunch of bandits. It's a completely different situation now." "That's right," the Roman said as she rocked back and forth on her horse, making the others worry that she would fall off at any moment. Brando, you said that the subterranean dwellers have a keen sense of smell and hearing. If we fight at night, it will be disadvantageous for us. If that's the case, we'll have to end this quickly." When she said that, the other three mercenary captains raised their attention and moved closer to the circle. Brando smiled when he noticed this. Even though he had never rejected an outsider from joining his circle, the three captains were still wary of this young noble. In fact, it was precisely because of this that Brando had never thought of reorganizing his mercenaries. Even though it was imperative, if he acted too rashly, the other party might misunderstand and rebel. That was why he chose not to mention it and waited for the other party to come to him on their own accord. This battle with the subterranean dwellers was one of the opportunities. End this quickly? It's not that simple. Cornelius shook his head and looked at Brando's expression. Even though I've never fought with the subterranean dwellers before, I can tell that they aren't just a bunch of bandits if they can defeat Groton. Although our mercenaries are better than Groton's private soldiers, there's a limit to their strength. Moreover, the scale of our troops this time is far smaller than the one Lord Groton used to deal with the subterranean dwellers. Then what should we do? The Roman blinked his large eyes and asked curiously. My lord wants to eliminate the subterranean dwellers' sentries, right? Amandina watched the last wind spirit spider disappear into the forest before looking at Brando. Is it to buy time before they react? Amandina thought for a moment. My lord, are you planning to attack one of the sawmills with lightning speed and lure the subterranean dwellers to attack? Brando turned his head, a hint of admiration flashing in his brown eyes. It was indeed his idea to switch from offense to defense. Good idea. Rabin's eyes flashed with the same admiration. But will it work? The Firelord Corps commander asked. The subterranean dwellers know that they have an advantage over us. If they lose during the day, they will definitely think of a way to take it back at night. Brando replied, we will be on the defensive during the night. They have the advantage of time and we have the advantage of location. The rest will depend on the morale, fighting strength, and the ability of the commanders. He was full of confidence when he said this, but he knew that he did not have any talent in tactics. In fact, this method was used by Cruz's players in the Amber Sword during the battle between Cruz and Georgandy Ridge. Even though he did not have any experience with the subterranean dwellers, he knew this trick. But what if they don't attack? Scarlet asked with a puzzled expression. Isn't that perfect? The Nightsong Tiger smiled. Then we will attack during the day. But he turned his head. But there's still a problem with the number of troops and fighting strength, my lord. Brando nodded and ordered the guide to lead the mercenaries to bypass the abandoned sawmill and directly set off for the nearest sawmill occupied by the subterranean dwellers. At the same time, he raised his head and looked at the sun that was slowly sliding to the west. He replied, this is indeed a problem, but I already have a plan. P.S. Something has happened recently which has greatly affected my mood. I'm sorry that I haven't updated well these few days. Chapter 255. It had been almost an hour since they entered the forest. The sound of arrows being fired could be heard from the forest. The mercenaries cheered and swarmed forward to drag the bodies out of the bushes. They were large, pale yellow creatures with tumors all over their bodies. Their heads were like giant tumors, and their eyes and nostrils could not be seen from their smooth surface. It was as if they lacked facial features. But hidden under their skin were thousands of sense of smell and hearing, which allowed them to be 100 times more sensitive than humans in the dark. But the mercenaries soon found that these creatures were already dead. The arrows only caused superficial wounds, but each of the subterranean dwellers had a fatal wound on their chest. Some of the wounds were from the back to the front, while others were from the front to the back. The wounds were all scorched black and they were all penetrating wounds. It was as if someone had pierced a hole in their chest with a thunderbolt. A few mercenaries recognized the special wound made by the dragoons. They flipped the disgusting creatures over and looked back at the young man who was slowly approaching them on his horse in awe. Brando looked down at the subterranean dwellers. They opened their mouths like sharks, and the blood that flowed out from the corners of their mouths was pale green. They were different from the warm-blooded creatures on the surface. These creatures were actually a type of lizard. If possible, Brando would have preferred to encircle these subterranean dwellers during the winter. According to convention, they would shrink their range of activity during the cold season. But unfortunately, time did not allow him to do so. Besides, the weather was getting colder. It was not the best, but at least it was not the worst situation. Under his signal, the mercenaries poked at the dead subterranean dwellers, allowing him to see the monster's stiff claws that were gripping their spears. They are the lower class of the subterranean dwellers, the Nightsong Tiger said as he looked at the corpses. It seems that they left their elites in the inner circle. The further we go in, the greater the resistance we will encounter. Brando nodded, but he did not say that it was actually good news. The monster's level would gradually increase from the outside to the inside. In the past, this was a relatively natural distribution of monsters in the Amber Sword, just like most traditional games. This meant that the subterranean dwellers had yet to form a complete military organization. To put it simply, they were not an army, but a tribe or some other form of subterranean dweller settlement. Before the attack, he was most worried that the subterranean dwellers in the Bearman Forest were a military organization of subterranean dwellers who came to the surface from the underground world. They might be part of a large tribe or even an underground city's plan to invade the surface. This was not uncommon in Wond. Sometimes, the residents of the underground world would also spy on the resources of the surface world. Although the resources underground were much more abundant, the survival of the fittest was even more cruel. The other possibility was that the subterranean dweller army suffered defeat in the underworld and fled to the surface world to survive. But either way, it was much easier to deal with them than a loose tribe. It was a normal monster area. Brando made up his mind about the subterranean dwellers in the forest. The corpses they found so far were the low-level subterranean dwellers who acted as scouts in the outermost periphery. There might also be subterranean dwellers and Kamuru, which meant warrior, in the underground language. The players called them elite subterranean dwellers, which were NCOs and had the strength of a peak iron rank. It could be said that other than the priests, they were the strongest fighting force of the subterranean dwellers. But for him, they were nothing to be afraid of. The mercenaries quickly sifted through the area like a net and found a total of more than 20 corpses, which was consistent with Brando's experience. These corpses showed that most of the subterranean dwellers did not have time to react when they were attacked. Under the attack of a silver rank, their lives were burned out in a very short time. The wind spirit spiders came from the wind elemental plane, Storm's End. Although their strength was not as strong as iron, their ability to control the flow of air was unparalleled. For the subterranean dwellers who relied on their sense of smell and hearing to distinguish danger, they were no doubt natural opponents. As the eyes were removed one by one, Brando and his 3 commanders, Yuta, Rabin, and Cornelius, led hundreds of mercenaries into the forest. Hundreds of warriors carefully moved through the forest in the silent afternoon. They stepped on the bright green ferns and made a rustling sound. Some of them even accidentally stepped on dead branches and broke them. But fortunately, when the soldiers raised their heads nervously, they only saw some unknown birds flapping their wings and flying up from the forest. But compared to the warriors and swordsmen, the magicians who were protected by the crowd were even more unbelievable. According to the usual practice, they would be the first target of the sneak attacks. Everyone knew the importance of a magician on the battlefield. However, for these spellcasters who were at most official adepts, and most of them were still apprentices, their ability to defend themselves was completely out of proportion to their value on the battlefield. It was as if they themselves understood that they were one of the favorite targets of scouts. Another target was the commanders in the army, but it was not as easy to kill them as low-grade magicians. Therefore, these mercenaries and magicians were used to being ambushed. Ambushes, sneak attacks, and arrows were a common occurrence in the forest. Almost every one of them had been injured at least once. They had also seen many of their companions die in front of them because of such ambushes. Some of them even had a personal experience of walking on the edge of life and death. However, all of this was nothing compared to the bizarre encounter today. The rumored subterranean dweller scouts seemed to have disappeared. Looking at the afternoon sun shining through the gaps between the leaves in the silent forest, the mages even wondered if this was a public holiday or some other kind of activity. But of course this was not the case. They had seen the bodies of the subterranean dwellers before. All of this could only be attributed to the magic of the young lord. There were even rumors that he was a high-grade summoner who might have even surpassed the boundary between the gold and silver. However, for the wizards, since this mysterious skill was taught to the mortals by the silver folk, respect for the strong had become a deep-rooted habit. Not to mention that he had the Shire under his command. The two gold wizards were privately called the Council of Two by the magicians among the mercenaries. Because in the custom of the Bugas, the Council of Wizards symbolized the power of authority and leadership. Therefore, Brando's prestige was unknowingly established among these magicians. But when Brando saw the mercenaries carrying long swords, halberds, longbows, shields and staffs, he felt no sense of accomplishment in his heart. Although the battle results of the wind spirit spiders were amazing, all of this was not without a price. He silently calculated the consumption of his spells. It had been almost an hour since he entered the forest. Just maintaining the Holy Sword card and charging an attack had consumed 13 points of Earth EP. He checked his elemental reserves. At this moment, the 32 slots of the Earth EP pool had already been emptied. There were only 7 slots left. Brendel frowned and immediately sent someone to call the guide over. The ragged man came in front of him and raised his head to see that the young man's expression was not very good. He thought that he had done something wrong to make the other party unhappy, so he asked anxiously, "Sir, what's the matter? How much longer do we have?" Brando asked a little anxiously. 5 more minutes, and he would have to give up on paying the next maintenance fee to let the Holy Sword card return to his deck because he had to reserve the cost of displaying the card again. The real battle would start at night or even at dawn. When the guide heard this, he sighed in relief. "We'll be there soon, my lord. You'll see it after going around the forest. The sawmill is built in the valley." Before he could finish, there was a cooing sound in front of him. It was a predetermined signal. Brando looked up and saw the mercenaries in front of him had stopped and crouched down. He also saw the warriors at the edge of the forest turn around and look in this direction. They then made a gesture to him. Brando recognized the gesture. Enemy spotted. However, the wind spirit spiders did not react, nor did they produce any experience points. This meant that the number of enemies might be quite large. The system could not kill the Dragon Knights in one shot. So, they followed his second-order and went into hibernation. Brando paused for a moment and immediately dismounted from his horse and walked towards the direction of the forest. Yuta, Rabin, and Cornelius glanced at each other before climbing down from their mounts. Then the Nightsong Tiger, Scarlet, and Roman followed suit. Finally, the merchant lady's eyes were filled with curiosity. The forest became sparse, and Brando quickly arrived at the edge of the forest. "My lord." He turned around and saw his former leader, Cornelius, nodding at him. Cornelius nodded at him, but he didn't expect that Cornelius would be able to do so. Brando did not say a word. The forest formed a slope in front of him, and at the bottom of the slope was the valley mentioned by the guide. The sawmill in Abes was built beside the river. Originally, there was only an empty space with a few wooden houses and a relatively large sawmill. Now, however, the place had changed. The subterranean dwellers had transformed it into a fortress. They used stones and wood to build a wall along the riverbank, and they even built watchtowers. Behind the wall, there were caves made out of earth and rocks. Brendel counted the numbers and estimated that there were at least 200 subterranean dwellers living here. So many of them, this is troublesome. Amandina frowned as she looked at the situation from behind. She looked at Brando, afraid that he would order them to attack. Brando looked at the patrolling squads of subterranean dwellers. Each squad was led by a subterranean dweller with dark red skin. Those were the Marukas. If they attacked rashly, they would retreat into the fortress and waste the advantage of a surprise attack. He looked back at Amandina and the Nightsong Tiger. "What do you think?" "Let's use our old method." The Nightsong Tiger replied. "Old method?" Brando raised his head. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 256. The The subterranean dwellers in the lumber mill soon noticed a group of adventurers on the other side of the river. The group consisted of a warrior, 2 crossbowmen, and a wizard. It was a common sight in both Erewhon and Cruz. The appearance of this group of humans was undoubtedly a provocation to the subterranean dwellers, who had a strong sense of territory. Soon a sharp whistle sounded in the camp, and the wooden gate creaked open. The subterranean dwellers rushed out, and 2 groups of more than 30 subterranean dwellers waded into the river. They split into 2 groups and tried to surround the group. The adventurers had obviously noticed the commotion. The crossbowmen fired 2 arrows, one of which missed and the other one hit, but it did not cause any damage. The crossbow arrow hit the chest of a subterranean dweller, and the huge impact caused it to take a step back in the river, splashing water, but that was all. The subterranean dweller shook its head, raised its spear and followed the group. Their skin is really thick. Cornelius, who was hiding in the bushes, frowned. The rumors were true. Even if there were 100 of them, we would have a hard time dealing with them. They're fast too. It took them only a few seconds to travel from the other side of the river to here. Yuta replied. Their speed is really scary. They're even faster than the best cavalry. Faster than the best cavalry? The tall commander of the Firelord Corps laughed. That's because you haven't seen the best cavalry, Miss Yuta. The red-haired mercenary was stunned and immediately glared at him. Brando nodded. The subterranean dwellers were about as fast as the second line of cavalry. They were slightly slower than the best warhorses. However, the best cavalry in Wone did not ride warhorses. For example, Erewhon's strongest night patrol knights. The name was used to describe the way these knights crossed the battlefield, calm and indifferent. In fact, it was a reference to the Flying Dragon Knights. Each of Erewhon's legions had its own division, and they were usually the best of the best. Stop arguing. Cornelius interrupted the conversation between Rabin and the female commander. Look, there are at least 200 subterranean dwellers in the lumber mill. With such a large number, our mercenaries will not be able to deal with them. The middle-aged man shook his head as he spoke. His silver hair shone under the sunlight. My lord, do you have any countermeasures? His gaze fell on Brendel, intentionally or unintentionally. Amandina snorted softly. She could see through Brendel's intentions. Brando and Scarlet's strength were indeed enough to break through the lumber mill. 2 gold ranked against 100 iron-ranked mercenaries would not be a problem. With the help of the mercenaries and the 3 great commanders, they would be able to take down the sawmill in 2 hours at most. However, if he were to be led by the nose by these guys, then what prestige would Sir Overlord have left? Moreover, when she looked at Brendel's calm and confident face, she knew that the young man she had been following for so long must have a plan in mind. Amandina coldly replied, the subterranean dwellers are not good at sieges. Lord Ron of Barcer once went deep into the earth to deal with these creatures, and he clearly described their habits in his books. The subterranean dwellers' abilities are the most limited in this area. They have even lost their best method of digging tunnels. No matter how thick their skin is or how fast they run, as long as we take over the sawmill and switch from offense to defense, they won't be able to do anything. Rabin turned to look at Brando and replied with a little surprise, there's such a thing? My lord must have considered this when he chose this place as the starting point of the attack, right? Brando's expression did not change, but the corners of his mouth could not help but twitch. He thought to himself that there really was no such thing. It was a common phenomenon for lumber mills to be located near the river. Firstly, it was convenient for downstream transportation. Secondly, it was possible to build a water wheel to drive the mill. After all, magic power was still a rare thing in this remote area. But he did not know much about Tonajal. He knew that there were 4 lumber mills near Abes. As for the condition of these lumber mills, only God knew. There is a countermeasure, Brando nodded. It depends on how many troops we can lure out. The young man turned around and smiled at his nominal subordinates. But everyone can relax. This battle isn't as difficult as you think. Just treat it as a warm-up for the mercenaries to get used to each other. Warm-up? Not only the 3 leaders but also the leaders of the small mercenary groups were stunned. More than 300 mercenaries against more than 200 subterranean dwellers. What kind of warm-up was this? It was going to be a tough battle. Let's wait and see. Brando calmed himself down and looked at the riverbank. The battle on the riverbank had just begun. When the adventurers realized the subterranean dwellers' intention, they began to retreat to the side of the forest. Although they were fast, they were still not as fast as the subterranean dwellers, and they were soon caught at the edge of the forest. However, the wizard in the team immediately knocked his staff on the ground and loudly chanted an incantation. With a loud crash, the pebbles and soil under their feet lifted off the ground and lifted the four of them up. The soil rose up and formed a 2-meter-tall, 3-meter-wide castle. It had a parapet and battlements, and the castle was made of solid earth and stone. It protected the four of them in the middle. City building. Everyone was taken aback. Only a level 3 law of defense spell could produce such an effect. Although it was still far from the realm of the legendary sorcerer who could create a city out of thin air, it at least proved that the sorcerer on the field was at least at the peak of iron rank. Who was so extravagant? The others turned their heads to see who was willing to send a third circle wizard to the front lines as bait. However, only Cornelius noticed the faint smile on Rabin's face, as if he didn't care at all. "Rabin, is that one of your men?" he asked in a low voice. The commander of the Firebrand Corps nodded without a care. "Mafri, the best wizard in my corps," he replied. "You're really generous." Cornelius did not feel relieved after confirming his suspicions. Instead, he felt a sense of crisis. The silver-haired middle-aged man looked at the tall and silent Rabin, then looked at the silent Brando. He suddenly felt that his position was shaken. He had fought side by side with the young lord for the longest time, and he thought that he would be able to leave a good impression on the youth with his performance. He did not expect that this quiet and honest veteran had unknowingly reached a tacit understanding with the young lord. Perhaps they had even come to an agreement. Cornelius cursed in his heart and gritted his teeth. However, his attention was immediately drawn to the battle at the edge of the forest. When Mafri retreated behind the warriors and crossbowmen to rest after casting the fortification spell, the middle-aged mage leaned his whole body on his cane and gasped for breath. The previous level 3 spell had obviously consumed a lot of his physical strength and energy. However, the effects were obvious. Just as Amandina had said, the subterranean dwellers were not good at sieges. These creatures that came from the underworld had strong hind limbs, but their forelimbs were short and weak. They did not rely on their upper limbs to attack because their forelimbs were only used to wield spears and tools. When the subterranean dwellers attacked, they relied on the strength of their hind limbs to charge forward and convert it into energy to attack their enemies. However, the wall alone was enough to cause them a lot of trouble. The 2-meter-high wall was not tall, but the subterranean dwellers realized that when they leaped up to attack the humans, they would be greeted with a cold glint of a sword, and they had no way of dodging it in midair. In just a single exchange, 2 of the subterranean dwellers were slashed back. The short corpses flew back and rolled a few times before coming to a stop. Their companions quickly made way for them and they slowed down their speed. Through the feedback of the sound waves, they discovered that there was a tall stone castle in front of them. The subterranean dwellers looked at each other, but the subterranean dweller, Moru, who caught up to them immediately let out a sharp whistle and ordered them to spread out and attack from all directions. "That's too much." Amandina furrowed her brows. She knew that the 4 mercenaries that were acting as bait were elites that Brando had handpicked from her subordinates. All of them were at least at the peak of iron ranked. Even if they were on flat ground, they would be able to withstand the attacks of 30 subterranean dwellers for a while, let alone when they had the terrain advantage. But no matter what, it was still too much for them to endure the attacks of 30 subterranean dwellers and lure them to send out more reinforcements. However, what she didn't expect was that after the purple-red subterranean dwellers forced their companions to launch 2 rounds of attacks, they decisively used a sharp whistle to order all the subterranean dwellers to retreat. They surrounded the stone castle and waited in formation. What was going on? The 4 mercenaries were waiting by the parapet. The previous battle had already exhausted much of their stamina. If the subterranean dwellers put in a little more effort, they might be able to take down this temporary fortress in one fell swoop. They didn't expect the subterranean dwellers to retreat at this moment. It was important to note that Wizard Mafri had already caught his breath. He would be able to join the battle again in a while. The subterranean dwellers aren't willing to pay the price. Although it's possible to take down the fortress in one fell swoop, it's impossible to do so without paying a huge price when the terrain and individual strength are not in our favor. Brando explained when he sensed the surprise on the faces of the mercenaries around him. Although these mercenaries were experienced in all sorts of battles, they didn't necessarily have any dealings with the underground creatures of Jorgandi. In the underground world where competition was cruel, population and military strength were both very precious resources. They were not allowed to be wasted. This was also the reason why the average strength of an individual in the underworld was relatively high. "I see." Cornelius glanced at Brando. As mercenaries, they didn't necessarily look up to nobles and scholars on the battlefield, but they couldn't help but look up to someone who was able to use their secret knowledge on the battlefield. "But I didn't expect the subterranean dwellers to be so weak." Don't they have the habit of building cities? Brando almost choked when he heard this question. He thought that the subterranean dwellers of Jorgundy Ridge were much better at building cities than humans. This was because the subterranean castles were first built to guard against the invasion of demons. The walls were thick and sturdy enough to make a human fortress like Bragg's blush with shame. As for the fortifications, they came from the dwarves living in the mountains. Cities like Ab's were nothing compared to them. It's not that the subterranean dwellers don't have the ability to attack cities, Cornelius replied. They are a first-class organization in Jorgundy Ridge, and they usually work together with another first-class organization called Bugbears. Bugbears? Rabin asked. Author's note: I've been painfully stuck in this story for a long time, but I'm slowly recovering. No one wants to stop updating. If you stop updating, you'll just miss out on the next chapter and I'll lose even more. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.